Her Spirits Rising to Playfulness, written by P.O. Dixon, read by Christopher. Chapter 1. Netherfield Park, Autumn 1811. Elizabeth Bennet sauntered slowly through the grounds of Netherfield Park by herself, the sun's warmth against her chin and her loose bonnet brushing her shoulders. She was unmoved by the beauty surrounding her. The peaceful chirping of birds was nothing more than faint background noise in her mind. Her thoughts were elsewhere. Spending time with people who disliked her as much as she disliked them was a test of her endurance. Solitary rambles afforded her a much-needed reprieve. Elizabeth suffered a combination of vexation and dread when she thought about having to endure yet another evening with those who disapproved of her. She had already put up with so much of their thinly disguised disdain since her arrival. In mere hours she must face yet another night in their presence. First, there were the Bingley sisters to contend with. The two had been all politeness and civility to Elizabeth's elder sister Jane, inviting her to Netherfield for tea, while the gentlemen dined with the officers. Neither they nor Jane could have foreseen the visit becoming such an extended stay, but by her mother's contrivance, Jane fell ill and had to remain at Netherfield while recuperating. After learning about Jane's prognosis, Elizabeth arrived the next day to care for her sister. The Bingley sisters had been so kind to her when she first came. They were eager to please, and their decorum and knowledge were admirable. Nevertheless, Elizabeth had occasionally wondered at them, and now she could not help but think she was being judged. She was aware of every curious glance cast her way. They carefully scrutinized each movement she made with an arched eyebrow. A rebuking assessment of her character marked each departure from their company. Were Elizabeth to rely solely upon their brother's friend, Mr. Darcy, she would say with certainty she was not only being judged but also deemed severely wanting. She could never forget his initial assessment of her the first time they met at the Meryton Assembly, when she overheard him remark to his friend that she was barely tolerable and not handsome enough to tempt him. Every time she noticed him looking at her since, she surmised he was doing so merely to bolster his original opinion. And then there was Mr. Bingley himself, the amiable gentleman from the north, who had recently let Netherfield, or, as otherwise referred to by her eager matchmaking mother, a single man with a large fortune who stood in dire need of a wife. Fortunately, the gentleman was half in love with her elder sister, which must undoubtedly bode well for Jane's future felicity. Elizabeth stepped lightly along the path, gazing at the manor house before her. She exhaled, deciding that visiting the library would be an excellent way to distract her mind and find something else to occupy her thoughts. When she arrived at the library doors, she was immediately enveloped by its warm embrace of knowledge. The scent of old leather bindings and aged paper filled her nostrils. A serene smile graced her countenance as she meandered among the shelves. She gracefully ran her slender fingers along their spines, intently seeking any book to capture her curiosity. The Netherfield library was scant at best. Most of the books were old and dusty, with covers worn with age. Only a few were new and inviting. A particular book caught Elizabeth's eye, and she pulled it from its place on the shelf. As she read, she found herself completely lost in a world of words where endless possibilities awaited around every corner. Her worries faded away until all that remained was vivid imagery spreading across page after page of beautiful prose. Stretching her arms over her head, Elizabeth emerged from her reverie some time later. What had been a dull afternoon has become quite interesting indeed. By now, she was sure Jane must be wondering where she'd gone for so long. Elizabeth closed the book and was about to place it back on the shelf when she heard two gentlemen enter the library. She recognised one of the voices as Mr. Darcy's and the other as Mr. Bingley's. From the sound of the conversation, they were clearly discussing Mr. Bingley and Jane. With heightened curiosity and wishing to know more, Elizabeth concealed herself behind the stately mahogany shelves, eyeing the two cautiously and listening intently to their discourse. She noticed a haughty officiousness on Mr. Darcy's face as he sat in one of the imposing library chairs. His companion listened intently as Mr. Darcy extolled the disadvantages of pursuing a relationship with a young woman whose circumstances in life were so poor and further-sighted that it was only sensible for a gentleman to take his time to meet a young woman who was worthy of him. A stifled gasp was quickly cut off as Elizabeth covered her mouth with her hand, muffling the sound that tried to escape. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her body froze with an uncomfortable mixture of outrage and disbelief. The steady hum of conversation increased in volume as the two men debated this matter, and the intensity of their disagreement soon increased. The room seemed suddenly much smaller than it had when Elizabeth first arrived. Aware of the tension in the air, she found the conversation kept returning to one individual, her elder sister, Jane. Elizabeth's eyes darted between the two men, her mind alert to every nuance in their exchange, until finally Mr. Darcy cleared his throat and stood. He spoke with such strength that the library walls reverberated with his conviction. "You astonish me, Bingley," said Mr. Darcy with a hint of annoyance. "You have known her for only 3 weeks and are already considering making her an offer of matrimony? I dare say she will never be such a wife as she should be. Finding a suitable match must take precedence over sentimentalism and other such things. You must not be blinded by foolish passion or be beguiled by a pretty face." The words reverberating through the air were enough to send a chill down poor Elizabeth's spine. The proud yet aloof Fitzwilliam Darcy spoke of her beloved elder sister with such contempt, humiliation, and scorn evident in his every word. She shrank back, wishing she could disappear from the library before she was caught eavesdropping. The words Elizabeth heard from Mr. Darcy shocked and appalled her. How could he be so insensitive and disrespectful? Jane is an angel in my estimation. She's gentle and kind and has a heart of gold. It was difficult for her not to interrupt them and express her opinion. Still, she kept her mouth shut and listened to the two men argue about the merits of a love match. "No," replied Mr. Bingley, his countenance betraying signs of vexation. "I have not communicated the depth of my feelings to her in any explicit manner. I cannot deny that her beauty has captivated me, but this emotion I now feel is of a kind I am quite unfamiliar with." Mr. Darcy's countenance became most severe. "Indeed, sir, you lack understanding of the fairer sex. To comprehend their true worth and beauty, one must be privy to the inner workings of their delicate nature, and even then there is no certainty." Bingley stood up and looked Mr. Darcy in the eye. "I know what I feel. I'm not a fool, and I believe I am capable of knowing what is right for me. Bingley, I dare say Miss Bennet would not be a suitable wife for you. She does not possess the wealth or standing in society that some might favour for you. She suffers from the lack of proper accomplishments that a young lady of status should possess. I do not understand why you are so fond of her. I assure you, Darcy, Jane is all I could wish for in a wife. The qualities she possesses are those I esteem most highly. I think she is just what a young woman ought to be. I am confident she is in every way suited to be my future companion. I contend she is not worthy of you, Bingley. How can you even contemplate marrying her without the question of money, which is the most important thing? How can I help it? I have the greatest regard for her. I love her dearly, and I know she will reciprocate my feelings. I love her, Darcy, and I know you are concerned for me, but I can assure you she will be a good wife. She will be faithful and devoted." Mr. Darcy replied with a slightly raised brow, "You are too romantic, Bingley. You do not consider all the ramifications of such a decision." "I have made up my mind, Darcy. I mean to be engaged to be married to Miss Bennet in under a month, 2 months at the most, but not a minute beyond that." Mr. Darcy eyed him with concern. "I am aware of the consequences," Bingley continued. "Perhaps I am not considering all of them. Perhaps I am blind to what is important. All I know is that I love her. I know she loves me too." Darcy sighed heavily. "Bingley, please, I beg of you. You're throwing your life away. You're a gentleman. You will rise in society. You will marry a lady with an excellent family and money. Of that I am certain if you will but be patient. You shall have years to decide. I will marry a girl whom I love, and I know she loves me. I hope you will come to your senses, Darcy. I further hope you will not continue in your prejudices regarding my beloved Jane. When you become better acquainted with her, I trust your sentiments will change." Mr. Darcy shook his head. "When you left Netherfield Park, however impulsively done, I thought surely you were taking steps towards securing your place in society as a proper gentleman. Not only is marrying a young woman with no fortune and want of connections a detriment to your future standing, but it would place an undue burden on you, what with her family's tenuous situation, 4 unwed sisters with meagre dowries, I suspect, a silly mother, and a neglectful father whose estate is entailed to the male line of the family. The Bennets are but a mere breath away from destitution. You, on the other hand, have a bright future ahead of you. So why would you want to throw it away for a young woman like Miss Bennet? Are you certain that she deserves such a sacrifice?" Mr. Darcy's words pierced through Elizabeth's heart like a dagger. A breath away from destitution? Such a sacrifice? Is my dearest sister undeserving of loving and being loved in return by an honourable man, even if he is wealthy? Elizabeth had never heard such a harsh appraisal of her family and could hardly bear the burning disgust that filled her chest. Mr. Darcy's cold and calculating tones made her sister seem like a mere object, someone to be disdained for daring to think she might rise above her class. Elizabeth could not believe that the man she had initially disliked for his arrogance, pride, and aloofness could be so apathetic and blind to the power of love. She was livid and appalled by Mr. Darcy's words, and had to strive to restrain her anger. She wanted to defend her beloved sister, her family, and Jane's honour, but she held her tongue. All she could do was stand there in silent protest, watching as the two men argued and debated the weight of Mr. Bingley's conviction. It was nearly too much for her to take. "My esteem for your judgment is unbounded, my dear Darcy," said Bingley, "but in this matter, I fear I cannot assent to your opinion. Miss Bennet is a lady of the utmost excellence and virtue. If you disapprove of her, that is your opinion, and your right. Shall we then agree to disagree? My purpose is determined, and I shall not be swayed from it." "I will agree to table this discussion for now," said Mr. Darcy, a slight yet determined edge to his voice. "It may be productive to evaluate our differences of opinion on the green baize of the billiards room, but if I should prove victorious in such a trial, you shall concede to abandon the scheme of allying yourself with that most disagreeable family. I shall gladly join you for a round of billiards, my friend, for I cannot think of a better way to pass the time until Miss Bennet joins us in the drawing-room after dinner. As for the outcome of your proposed wager, I dare not entertain such a notion." "We shall see," Mr. Darcy said, preparing to quit the room, unaware that Elizabeth had heard it all. Elizabeth watched, her heart pounding in her chest. She had heard too much. "It is abundantly clear to me that Mr. Darcy disapproves of my sister, but what right does he have to critique her in such a callous manner?" When she could, Elizabeth, agitated and confused, made her way from the library's bookshelves. It took all her control not to confront Mr. Darcy and admonish him about his despicable behaviour. Instead, she had to remind herself that he was a guest in his friend's home, just as she and her sister were, and she had to remain hospitable. Nevertheless, the injustice of the situation had thoroughly roused her indignation. "My sister deserves more respect than the proud man afforded her. I am determined to make him see that, no matter what it takes." Chapter 2. Elizabeth stomped around her bedroom, her rage and indignation boiling up from within. She had been trying to quell the flames of anger burning through her soul, but the remembered injustice of her sister's plight fed the fury even more. She could not understand how anyone could be so callous as to reject someone without giving them a chance. Mr. Darcy's insistence that Jane was not good enough belittled the connection she saw between Jane and Mr. Bingley, and the thought of that made her blood boil. The injustice of it all filled her pores with righteous anger, and she became more agitated with every step she took. How she despised Mr. Darcy and those of his ilk who were so fixated on rank and prestige that they lost sight of what truly mattered in life: kindness, respect, and compassion for one another. Elizabeth continued to pace, but succumbed to exhaustion, as her fiery energy slowly ebbed away. Finally she fell back onto her bed, still fuming with anger at the memory of Mr. Darcy's harsh words directed at Jane. Her mind was a swirl of sentiments as she tried to make some sense of the situation. Anger, hurt, and humiliation were all mixed in a turbulent storm of thoughts. She turned over in her bed, determined to find some sort of resolution to the situation that had so rapidly and unexpectedly unfolded. Just as Elizabeth was about to drift off into an inevitable restless sleep, an idea came to her. She immediately sat upright, her gaze piercing the darkness as she worked out the details in her mind. The more she thought about it, the more she realised that the solution was quite clear. She could make Mr. Darcy pay for his harshness towards Jane through shrewd, meticulous manipulation of his own sensibilities. She rose from the bed and began pacing back and forth across her room, her nightgown billowing behind her. Her plan was simple: make him fall in love with her, and then reject him. Her plan had a certain elegance to it. However, she knew a host of challenges would come with it. Mr. Darcy was a proud man. It would be difficult to make someone so proud and arrogant submit to her whims. But Elizabeth was determined and confident she could do it, supposing he was even capable of falling in love, which was yet to be seen. By the time she returned to Longbourn, implementing her scheme was her favourite wish. She would have liked to hash out her scheme with her elder sister, but she did not dare for fear of how Jane would react. The latter being more forgiving than Elizabeth, she might very well disapprove. Thus Elizabeth kept her own counsel until she could consult like-minded company, namely her intimate friend Miss Charlotte Lucas from the neighbouring estate, Lucas Lodge. Elizabeth confided in her friend her ambitious scheme for obtaining a marriage proposal when she could. Though Charlotte had advanced to 27 years of age without making any matrimonial prospects for herself, her intelligence and acumen were unsurpassed. Or so Elizabeth supposed, when it came to helping her devise the most advantageous course of action to ensure her success in reaching her goal. "How very intriguing," Charlotte uttered, her eyes alight with curiosity. "How may I be of help?" "As a woman of sound judgment, I thought it prudent to entreat your opinion on how to best set my plan into motion." "What then is your scheme?" Charlotte questioned. "Alas, I have none planned as yet. That is to say, while I am clear on the outcome, the means of bringing it about have yet to be determined. Pray, how does a young woman go about enticing a man to tender his offer of marriage?" Elizabeth's countenance expressed her utter despair. Charlotte uttered gently but curiously, "Pray tell me, why did you not simply request advice from your mother? I am certain that she would know how best to proceed." Elizabeth's mother, Mrs. Francine Bennet née Gardiner, was a woman of limited knowledge and uncertain temper, whose life's purpose was to marry off her 5 daughters. Her heart was invariably in the right place, but her means were sometimes questionable. "Heavens forbid! If my mother gets a whiff of my plan, she will organise the entire nuptials before I realise what has occurred." Elizabeth shuddered. "A prospect I would find most unsettling, for I have no intention of getting married." "If I understand you correctly, you hope to receive a marriage proposal, though you have no intention of being swayed by it." "Indeed, that is my precise meaning. I will never return this particular gentleman's affections, as he is the last man I would consider accepting as my husband." "Indeed, your audacity is commendable. However, I do not comprehend your stratagem. Why would you go to the trouble of getting a marriage proposal without intending to accept it?" "It appears rather peculiar," Charlotte uttered with a tilt of her head. "Explaining the matter to you is likely to be the most straightforward part of the whole affair," Elizabeth stated with a mischievous twinkle in her eye. "Very well, then. So what is it you are attempting to accomplish?" Charlotte asked. "My primary aim is to secure the notice of a certain gentleman of fine standing. I must draw him in and secure his affections, and only then can I spurn his advances," she uttered, with a coy smile. Charlotte's brows rose in astonishment. "So you intend to have the gentleman make an offer of marriage and then refuse him?" "Precisely." "It is not at all like you to engage in such folly. You must really detest this man." "Oh, I do. I really do." "Who is the gentleman in question?" "That would be Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy." Charlotte's eyes sparkled with surprise. "Oh my, so it is to be a game of vanity. Is this your way of assuaging your wounded pride because he declared you not handsome enough to tempt him? You want to show the gentleman that his wealth and social status cannot tempt you. That is very brave of you, my dear Eliza. It was not merely the insult to me that has put me in such a perturbation of spirit. It was a more recent affront against my dearest sister Jane. Charlotte, you cannot possibly imagine what he has done." "What has he done?" "I overheard him vehemently argue with his friend Mr. Bingley that the idea of making an offer of marriage to Jane had to be abandoned, for he finds our family's lack of fortune and want of connections an insurmountable impediment. It was all I could do not to run up to him and demand an explanation for such abhorrent behaviour." Charlotte gasped. "You must have been so hurt and disappointed. What an insult against your sister. It is incomprehensible how anyone can be so callous." "That is true, and I vow no mercy for him. That is why I am determined to discover a way to exact revenge. I do not wish to accept an offer from him. I only want to make him suffer the humiliation of being rejected by a Bennet daughter." Charlotte shook her head. "It is a daring plan, Eliza. Can you, with surety, resolve to take such a course?" Elizabeth nodded resolutely. "My determination is set, and I shall need assistance in my endeavour. Will you support me?" Charlotte smiled in assent. "I perfectly comprehend your feelings and am ready to help you with whatever I can. Let us devise an approach that will draw the notice of Mr. Darcy." After a moment's reflection, Charlotte devised a plan of attack. "I believe, my dear," she said, "to set the stage for an offer, a most delicate balance must be struck. You once argued that dancing is the best means of encouraging affection, did you not? You must find ways to employ that stratagem. If you get such an opportunity, like a Scottish reel at an informal gathering, seize it. Additionally, affectionate gazes from across the room on your part may effectively set the stage. Perhaps a stroll through a garden, or a pleasant jaunt to some other pleasing location, Oakham Mount, for instance, would afford intimacy conducive to your purpose. But you must be careful not to be too obvious in your intentions, for that could jeopardize the entire endeavour." Elizabeth nodded in agreement. "Your advice is most sensible. What other steps should I take, pray tell?" "Bestow simple tokens of endearment," Charlotte replied with a smile. "Listen to his words with enthusiasm. Even the slightest brush of your hand against his arm should suffice. Ensure he is always aware that you are in his presence, yet do not be imprudent or aggressive. Nay, too much familiarity could have an adverse effect on him." "To put it another way," Elizabeth began, her spirits rising to playfulness, "observe how Miss Bingley behaves, and then do the complete opposite." Her friend chuckled. "Exactly. Thank you, Charlotte. That is excellent advice. I think I have the makings of a plan now. Though I will not venture to speak of my expectations, I shall do everything within my power to ensure its success." Charlotte let out a sigh. "Well then, you have a considerable task ahead of you. I suspect Mr. Darcy is a proud, grave man who is not easily won over. I do not envy you this mission." "That I must play a subtle game is certain," said Elizabeth, "but I am undeterred in my resolution to succeed." "You will be called upon to exercise a great degree of strategy," Charlotte returned. "How can I be of service?" "I require your aid as my confidant. I need someone to vent to and seek advice as I execute my plan. I dare not trick myself into thinking my scheme is easy. Indeed, I agree that Mr. Darcy is not easily swayed by emotion, his nature being one of pride and reserve. Then we must tailor our course of action to his temperament. You shall show him the error of his ways with your wit and discernment. No doubt it shall be your greatest victory." Elizabeth smiled her agreement. "It shall indeed." "Allow me then to be an ally in your pursuit of justice," Charlotte offered with a genuine smile of encouragement. "Thank you, Charlotte," Elizabeth said gratefully. "Your friendship means so much to me, and I cannot express how much I value it." Charlotte reached out and gave Elizabeth's hand a gentle squeeze. "It is my honour to be of service. Let's huddle together and map out a plan of action." Having sought and received input from her friend, Elizabeth finalised her scheme. She knew that the gentleman, Mr. Darcy, was used to getting his way and having everything go according to his plan. So she decided the best way to catch his attention was to be unpredictable and not follow his expectations. "I simply need to speak my mind more openly, especially if it means going against Mr. Darcy's opinions, even if it means going against my own. Anything to challenge him and pique his interest. I shall also make a point of showing off my wit and intelligence, as I suspect Mr. Darcy values such qualities in a woman." Elizabeth knew that if her plan were to succeed, she'd first have to get close enough to Mr. Darcy for him to form any attachment toward her. While this could prove difficult considering their past interactions, Elizabeth also knew that Mr. Darcy already had a certain level of interest in her, even if it was merely to find fault. If I play my cards right, I can use this peculiar interest against him and eventually bend him to my will. With renewed determination, she threw herself into hammering out the details of her scheme. Convincing someone as proud and arrogant as Mr. Darcy to fall in love was a task that no woman before her had likely accomplished. But Elizabeth had faith in herself, and was confident that with some ingenuity she might just succeed. Elizabeth was abuzz with energy as she contemplated her new mission. She had never experienced this kind of emotion before. It was exhilarating. Love was something that she had always thought of as spontaneous and uncontrollable. "Can I really make him fall in love with me?" Elizabeth thought to herself, her determination fueled at the idea of carrying out such a feat. She knew it was an uphill battle, and there would be moments when she would feel like giving up. But she refused to allow such insecurities to stop her. reminding herself that even if it didn't work out, she could at least say she had tried. "Yes," she whispered to herself, a newfound courage in her voice. "I can do this." Chapter 3. The idea of marrying the eldest Bennet daughter was so well fixed in Bingley's mind that he invited the entire family to dine at Netherfield, not 3 days since the 2 Bennet daughters had returned to Longbourn. Darcy was walking in the garden, his means of escaping Bingley's guests for the evening, when he heard the voices of 2 women, Miss Elizabeth and Miss Bennet. He paused and listened in confusion when he heard them discussing a scheme that centred on him. First, Elizabeth was plotting to make him fall in love with her way of avenging his supposed offences against her elder sister. Then she planned to reject him when he proposed, leaving him humiliated. To Miss Bennet's credit, this appeared to be her first time hearing of her sister's plans, and, as best he could surmise, she was not entirely in favour of such a stratagem. But that did not lessen its sting. A wave of indignation roared through his veins. How dare Elizabeth Bennet toy with him like that? His heart sank like a stone as he heard her words. Of all the people of Hertfordshire, he thought she had seen the better part of him. Yet here she was talking of such a plan, the one woman who had captivated him like no other before her. Then something inside him shifted, and he felt inspired to prove his worth to her. If she wants to use me for her amusement, I will use this situation to show her I am so much more than an arrogant man who judges others for their social standing. As Darcy stepped out of the shadows, the Bennet sisters were startled and they gasped. Elizabeth looked at him with surprise and a hint of fear in her eyes. He straightened himself up and tried to appear as confident as possible. Challenge accepted. "Miss Bennet, Miss Elizabeth," he said, bowing slightly. "I hope you don't mind my interrupting." He looked at Jane and continued, "But your mother was wondering what had become of you. I volunteered to come in search of you." Jane was gone directly, leaving Darcy and Elizabeth standing there. His gaze intently settled on Elizabeth. He said, "If you're in the mood for a bit of fun and games, Miss Elizabeth, what say you to a chess match? I know how much you enjoy cunning tactics and other stratagems, and I dare say I have a few tricks up my sleeve." Elizabeth's mouth gaped, unsure whether he had overheard her and her sister. He smiled inside at her confusion, and upon receiving her assent by way of a nod, he turned and walked away into the darkness of night, a satisfied smirk on his face. For the next hour the 2 of them played chess. For Elizabeth the game was both an emotional and a mental trial, for she had to remain focused on the game and battle her emotional insecurities, embarrassment, uncertainty and confusion. Had he overheard her speaking with Jane or not? And if he had, why had he not confronted her? Mr. Darcy was utterly unreadable to her, wearing his mask of indifference well, focusing entirely on the game and its complexities. Eventually, what seemed like a close victory for Elizabeth turned out to be a victory for Mr. Darcy. He had made a move she hadn't seen coming, and she had been backed into a corner. When Elizabeth thanked him for the game, she felt a sudden spark when she and Mr. Darcy exchanged glances. She knew that things had shifted in the air between them, but she wasn't sure if it was her imagination or something more. Mr. Darcy exited without another word, leaving Elizabeth to mull over what had just happened between them. Could she have made progress in her mission to make him fall in love with her so soon? What else could she do to melt his frozen heart? As these thoughts raced through her mind, she felt a shiver of anticipation. Whatever comes next, I am ready for it. Chapter 4. The walls of the assembly room seemed to close in around Darcy as he stepped inside. His heart raced. This was the second time he'd attended such a gathering. This time, he wanted to be there. The clicking of heels against the floor sent a ripple of anticipation down his spine. His eyes scanned the crowd for Elizabeth, the young lady who had contrived a plan to humiliate him. If he did not know it before, he certainly knew it at that moment. Elizabeth possessed an intelligence and a strength that he had never encountered in a young woman. She was not the first female who sought to manipulate his feelings, but she was the first to attempt such a ruse with revenge as her sole motive. He was simultaneously repulsed and enthralled. He spotted her talking with some friends and couldn't help but marvel at her loveliness, her bewitching eyes, her light and pleasing figure. He couldn't take his eyes off her, watching with admiration as she moved gracefully through the crowd, engaging with friends and acquaintances along the way. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward, determined to make his way toward her. When he reached her side, he cleared his throat to garner her attention. "Mr. Darcy," she said, "we meet again." Recommending himself to strangers had never been his strong suit, but Elizabeth was hardly a stranger, and if he was going to improve her opinion of him by showing her a more amiable side of himself, he had better say something. He didn't know what to say, and if she hadn't stepped closer, he was not sure he could have managed any words at all. The closer she got, the more he could make out how her lips curled up into a slight smirk, like she knew something he didn't. "Miss Elizabeth," he finally said, mustering all his strength so as not to let her see how her presence affected him. Elizabeth's lips tightened into a thin line before her expression softened slightly. "I hope your seeking me out means we will resume our amiable accord from our last evening at Netherfield." Mr. Darcy nodded approvingly. "I hope so too." A moment passed before Elizabeth sighed and continued. "In that spirit, sir, I shall expect the honour of standing opposite you at least once this evening, if not twice. I say this despite knowing how much you dislike dancing, especially in such an assembly as this. What say you?" "I say you are very bold." "Oh, I am nothing if not bold and determined. I dare say it would surprise you to know the lengths I will go to in order to get my way. So she is determined to carry on with her little ruse." Darcy felt a sudden rush of determination of his own flooding through him. If Elizabeth was intent on behaving in such a fashion, he would show her what it meant to be truly in control by exhibiting unparalleled patience and respect despite her apparent contempt for him. Half wishing to put an end to their subterfuge and half knowing it was not the time, not until he had accomplished his own goal, he said, "I have no doubt of your belief in your convictions and your strength of determination, Miss Elizabeth. I admire that about you." He paused for a beat before continuing, his voice softer than before. "But remember that no matter how much one might try to control things, it doesn't always work out the way one plans." Darcy took a step closer to her and leaned in. "No matter one's good intentions," he concluded. For a moment he thought he saw a flicker of something unfamiliar in her eyes, before she stepped back and nodded. "I understand, Mr. Darcy. I shall treasure your wise words." The two of them stood in a charged silence before Elizabeth tore her eyes from his. "I shall see you on the dance floor then, sir," she said before walking away. Mr. Darcy watched her as she retreated, filled with admiration at her poise and resolve. She had no idea he was keenly playing his own game too, to win her good opinion. As for what might happen next, it was up to fate to decide. Chapter 5. Elizabeth felt her heart race as she stepped through the entrance of Lucas Lodge, fully aware that Mr. Darcy was somewhere among the gathering. Consumed with a peculiar mix of excitement and uncertainty, she scanned the room, her eyes eventually locking onto the outline of Mr. Darcy. She closed her eyes and took a deep, steadying breath, a smirk playing on her lips. She knew there was no turning back now. Every detail had been planned out, every word memorized. It is time once again to push forward with my plan to humble the proud Mr. Darcy. She held her head high and exuded an air of grace and elegance as she moved through the crowd, playing a role meant to distract everyone from her true intentions. She gained the attention of many guests along the way. But steady to her purpose, Elizabeth focused on Mr. Darcy. His relentless stare caused a shiver down her spine as it followed her every move, only seeming to fuel the fire that had been burning within her chest since she had first come up with her plan of revenge. At length, Elizabeth made her way over to her main destination, Mr. Darcy's side. After greeting each other in the usual way, she said, "Mr. Darcy, despite having known each other for weeks, I feel we are still strangers to each other. I feel it is hardly fair, the two of us being so close in proximity yet miles apart in understanding each other's character." Her eyes were wide and unblinking as she waited for his answer, her heart beating furiously. "How do you suggest we amend that, Miss Elizabeth?" Elizabeth thought for a moment, then replied, "Well, I know all about your library and your home in Derbyshire from Miss Caroline Bingley, and I know you have a younger sister too. But what of your other family?" Darcy's features softened as he said, "My parents are no longer with us, and my cousin, Colonel Fitzwilliam, and I are my sister's guardians. He is the second son of my uncle, the Earl of Matlock." "You have my condolences on the loss of your parents," Elizabeth said. "Thank you, Miss Elizabeth," Mr. Darcy said as he leaned in slightly and softened his voice. "I'm sure I can talk about my family for hours, but to what avail? I would much rather you tell me more about those things about you I have yet to discern." She shrugged. "Apart from my London relations, you have already met all my family. I do not know what I might add toward your enlightenment. I understand you are an ardent reader. Perhaps we could discuss our mutual enthusiasm for books. That certainly would supply much entertainment, but I fear that the conversation on this subject would be so captivating, we would find ourselves embroiled in impassioned intercourse until the wee hours of the morning. In that case, I can hardly wait until the timing is right for just the two of us to broach the subject." Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat as she heard the underlying implication of Mr. Darcy's words. Was he really falling under her power? "Timing is everything, and as I dare not suspend any pleasure of yours for too long, sir, I look forward to the occasion with equal alacrity," Elizabeth said. Her words hung in the air like an alluring fog, daring him to respond in kind. Mr. Darcy's countenance gave no indication of his feelings on the matter, yet Elizabeth was well aware that something lurked beneath the placid surface, for his eyes were eloquent and spoke volumes, telling her all she needed to know. Having accomplished what she set out to do, Elizabeth drew back slightly, offering Mr. Darcy a last glimpse of a vision that would stay with him long after their first encounter of the evening was over, hiding any trace of fear or hesitation beneath a mask made from layers of strength and assurance, as if she held all the cards in a card game where he had no chance but to fold. Although he said nothing, Elizabeth could tell from his expression that he understood. He knew full well that something had changed between them. From what Elizabeth had said, she knew he was now fully aware of her intentions. Feigned though said intentions happened to be, Darcy's reflections on the evening wore heavily on his mind. Something fundamental seemed to have changed between Elizabeth and him. She seemed bolder, more daring in her words. At the same time, he found his resolve melting under her own, wondering how far she was willing to carry her point. Despite the warnings of my pride and upbringing, I'm increasingly drawn to Elizabeth and her lively spirit. Still, he knew he needed to remain guarded with respect to his increasing admiration for her. When she suggested discussing their mutual love of reading, he couldn't help but think of the hours they could spend in intellectual and passionate discourse about the written word. But for now, all he could do was mask his true feelings and relish whatever time he had in her presence while he could. Such were his thoughts when he was thinking of her with some complacency when thus accosted by Miss Bingley. "I can guess the subject of your reverie," she purred, as though the ability to read his mind was in her power. "I should imagine not. You are considering how insupportable it would be to pass many evenings in this manner, in such society. Indeed, I am quite of your opinion. I have never been more annoyed. The insipidity, and yet the noise, the nothingness, and yet the self-importance of all these people. What would I give to hear your strictures on them?" "Your conjecture is totally wrong, I assure you." My mind was more agreeably engaged. "I have been meditating on the immense pleasure a pair of fine eyes in the face of a pretty woman can bestow." Miss Bingley immediately fixed her eyes on his face. "Pray, what lady among us has the credit of inspiring such reflections, if I might ask?" "Miss Elizabeth Bennet," Mr. Darcy replied. "Miss Elizabeth Bennet," repeated Miss Bingley. "I am all astonishment. How long has she been such a favourite? And pray, when am I to wish you joy?" "That is exactly the question that I expected you to ask. A lady's imagination is very rapid. It jumps from admiration to love, from love to matrimony in a moment. I knew you would be wishing me joy. Nay, if you are serious about it, I shall consider the matter absolutely settled. You will have a charming mother-in-law indeed, and of course she will always be at Pemberley with you." Darcy listened to Miss Bingley with perfect indifference while she entertained herself in this manner. Her wit flowed long as his composure convinced her that all was safe. But, in truth, the young lady's rambling was the furthest thing from his mind. How can I help but feel anxiousness and anticipation at the thought of what might come next where Elizabeth is concerned? Is she as resolved against me as ever, or am I gaining strength in dismantling her predetermined scheme against me? I can only wish for the latter. When the evening drew to its close and the room started to empty, Elizabeth looked at Mr. Darcy. She silently bid him farewell for that night upon catching his eye. Long, drawn-out farewells among friends impeded her immediate exodus. Before Elizabeth left, however, she glanced back one last time to find that Mr. Darcy was still standing in the same spot, his determined gaze watching her leave with an expression that she could only describe as admiration and longing. At that moment, Elizabeth's heart raced with a newfound realization. Maybe, just maybe, her plan to make Mr. Darcy fall in love with her would not be as hard to carry off as she had thought. She smiled at Mr. Darcy, feeling emboldened with an extra boost of confidence as she walked out of the room, more confident than ever that she could succeed in her mission. Chapter 6. Mr. Bingley and Jane had made such swift progress on their journey to Oakham Mount that day that it seemed to Elizabeth as if she and Mr. Darcy were alone on their expedition. They sauntered amicably along the pathway, their echoing steps muffled only by the buzzing of the wildlife in the bucolic countryside. The sun was shining overhead, warming their backs as they walked. Elizabeth was sure Mr. Darcy could feel her gaze, but he seemed to be studying the trees and the wildlife around them instead. The trees rustled in the breeze, causing the leaves to pirouette gracefully in the air. The birds sang out from their branches, their melodies a balm to the soul. The sky was a brilliant expanse of blue, dotted here and there with white clouds, and the aroma of mid-autumn was potently discernible. Elizabeth's countenance bloomed with emotions, expectant conquest, ambitious pride, and a determined spirit. She could feel her heart beating a little faster, her anticipation growing as she imagined the conversation she longed to have with Mr. Darcy. She wanted to make him fall in love with her, to exact revenge for his callous treatment of Jane. She knew it was a game, but was determined to see it through. She stole a brief glance at him, her eyes lingering momentarily. He seemed to be taking in the sights, his expression one of serene contentment. She imagined he was genuinely enjoying the stillness of the day and the beauty of the surroundings. But she was impatient for something more. She wanted to hear words of love flowing from his lips. They continued to walk, their conversation light and inconsequential. Elizabeth tried to steer the discussion to more engaging subjects, the kind that stimulated one's passions. But Mr. Darcy seemed content with their current course. She wasn't sure if he was playing a game too, or if he was just not interested in what she had to say. At long last they arrived at the breathtaking vista. Seeing it made Elizabeth's heart rise to her throat, and a swell of rapture filled her from head to toe. She silently wished that time would stand still so she could relish the moment's beauty forever. She turned to Mr. Darcy, her eyes holding his for a second before he tore his away. She knew he could feel the intensity of her watching him, but he seemed content to be looking at the sky, not at her. She wanted to draw him in, make him look at her and see her and understand the power of love and the intensity of her feelings for him, even if it was merely a pretense on her part. Alas, he gave not a single glance back at her. Instead, he stared at the horizon, as if waiting for something. Elizabeth bit her lip and her heart sank as a strange feeling of dissatisfaction took over. She wanted him to take her hand in his and tell her he had fallen in love with her, and wanted her to be his. But the moment passed and they continued on their way. Why was her plan to make him fall in love with her failing so miserably, like she was a beggar, unrequited and ignored? Like Miss Caroline Bingley, Elizabeth considered. Part of her knew his feelings toward her were not to be equated with his feelings for Miss Bingley. With Elizabeth he was cautious and a little reserved, and she supposed that her family's station in life likely had something to do with that. Even so, part of her could not help but wonder if that was all there was to it. The questions lingered in her mind even as they walked on in silence, their footsteps and the chirping of birds the only sounds breaking the stillness of the air. Elizabeth was beginning to doubt her power to win over the heart of such a prideful man, but she persevered, determined to see her plan through, even if the outcome might not be what she hoped for. She held fast to her resolution of maintaining silence, when suddenly he spoke in a way that quite took her by surprise. "Miss Elizabeth," he whispered. His voice was gentle, and when she looked into his eyes she saw something she hadn't expected. A spark of admiration, and something more. "Yes, Mr. Darcy," she replied, her heart pounding. He opened his mouth to say something, but hesitated, and the moment was gone. Despite that, Elizabeth had witnessed the brief change. She smiled to herself, her heart filled with hope, knowing she could bring Mr. Darcy to open up to her. Eventually. The path stretched out before Darcy, but his mind was elsewhere. Elizabeth was taking hold of his heart, though he fought against it. He had encountered so many women in town, and none of them made him feel the way she did, as if there was an ardent wish on his part to disclose all his thoughts and secrets to her. Even thinking about her caused a peculiar and unsettling warmth to flood his chest, which he couldn't deny. They had been silently walking along when she finally looked away from the path and at him. Out of the corner of his eye he could see the momentary confusion on her face, quickly replaced by a gentle expression he'd been waiting for. He had opened his mouth to speak, but hesitated, unsure if his words would be taken well. He had cleared his throat and whispered Elizabeth's name. She had met his eyes and replied without hesitation, and he was struck by the gentleness of her voice and the knowledge that she could bring him to open up to her, eventually. Her smile confirmed it, and Darcy felt a blossoming of happiness inside, a new feeling that he wanted to explore further. Surely she would not continue her pretense much longer. The feeling she incites in me cannot be entirely one-sided. He knew this was a dangerous game they were playing, one of trust and feelings and more, but he wasn't sure how it would end, which concerned him. What if this pretense she was perpetuating was all there was to it, her only motive being to exact her revenge for whatever grievance she harboured against him? Still, he was willing to take the risk. He wanted her for himself. He wanted to make her fall in love with him, as he was beginning to do with her. But before he could find the words, the moment was gone, and they both continued on their walk, carrying on with the game. Darcy couldn't help but wonder if his time for confessing his feelings was nigh. Timing is everything in this game we are playing. He steeled himself, determined to make the most of their time together until the moment was just right. Chapter 7. From suffering a sense of accomplishment one day to dejection the next, Elizabeth wavered between doubt and hope as she contemplated her decision to pursue Mr. Darcy. She considered the risks of her daring plan. Fear built up in her chest as the consequences of her actions loomed before her, a heavy weight pressing down on her, yet she could not let go of the persistent conviction that this was the right thing to do. As the days passed and their interactions increased steadily, she began chipping away at his icy demeanour, showing him kindness and understanding in the hopes of sparking something deeper. She was determined to crack the enigma of Mr. Darcy. With time and patience she began to see a transformation within him. His eyes would soften ever so slightly when he looked at her, and a hint of a genuine smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Those moments seemed to confirm that her efforts were producing a tangible result. Yet, his haughty air always had a way of resurfacing, leaving Elizabeth with the uncertainty of whether she had made any actual progress at all. True, Mr. Darcy does and says all the things a gentleman ought to do and say of late. But what if he is simply passing the time until he takes his leave of Hertfordshire? Thank goodness Elizabeth had her friend Charlotte to help her make sense of her predicament. Charlotte's expression was a troubled blend of apprehension and confusion. She squared her shoulders, her head shaking gently. "Are you really going to continue with this?" she asked, her voice quivering slightly. "I promised to support you, but I'm worrying now. Do you actually think it's worth it?" Elizabeth's heart pounded as thoughts of the potential consequences of actively pursuing Mr. Darcy, a man of infinite power, flooded her mind. A man of high social standing, who could easily ruin her reputation with a single word. She could feel the fear tightening its grip around her throat as she contemplated the possible ramifications. She drew in a shaky breath. Contemplating her choices, she tightly clenched her hands. "What else am I supposed to do? I can't just let him get away with what he did to Jane," she replied, her voice barely audible over her racing heartbeat. Charlotte looked away, seemingly unsure of what to say. "But now that you comprehend the risks to your own sensibilities, the stakes are so much higher, are they not?" she asked, unease clear in her voice. Elizabeth nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. She ran through all the potential ways it could go wrong in her head, all the ways Mr. Darcy could reject her, and the discomfort she might have to endure afterward. But then something sparked inside Elizabeth's mind and a smile spread across her face. "Maybe it won't be so bad," she said, determination vibrating in her voice. "Maybe Mr. Darcy has feelings for me already and is too proud to act on them." Charlotte looked at Elizabeth and smiled sadly. "Then I can only wish you luck," she said, pulling her friend close and giving her a hug before turning to make her way home. Elizabeth watched as Charlotte disappeared down the lane. Then she steeled herself and, to the extent necessary, her heart. She felt a wave of strength come over her as she realized that her current state was nothing more than a test of courage that could only be passed by having faith in herself and in life's unpredictable ways. She stood straight and tall and bravely marched forward with a newfound strength radiating with every step. Her confidence in her abilities increased with every review, further emboldening her. She was drawn to the challenge ahead, making Mr. Darcy show his hand. Usually Darcy would immediately excuse himself upon arriving at Longbourn and not seeing Elizabeth among the others. In this case, he had espied her with her friend Miss Lucas in the garden. Supposing the ladies were discussing secret affairs, he had opted to station himself with a favourable view of the garden instead. Darcy's eyes were fixed on Elizabeth, almost as if he were mesmerised by the sight of her. He watched her intently, studying her every move, every gesture, and every word. A strange mixture of sentiments threatened to overwhelm him. The two of them were spending more time in company of late, what with Bingley's courtship of Miss Bennet and the rather limited society the country afforded. To his dismay, the longer he spent in Elizabeth's presence, the more he felt his resolve melting away, revealing the depth of his affection for her. Memories of a particular evening spent in company with her crept into his mind. Save for Elizabeth's sister Mary, who sat at the opposite end of the parlour, reading her book by candlelight, he and Elizabeth had been alone. As the firelight danced across the room, illuminating her delicate features, he had quietly revealed his innermost thoughts to Elizabeth. He had never opened up that way before, yet it felt natural and comfortable with her. She listened attentively as though understanding and accepting him for who he was. As their conversations continued over the days that followed, he could feel an invisible wall slowly breaking apart between them. He slowly opened up more and more, enjoying every moment spent in her company. Then one day something miraculous happened. A genuine smile escaped his lips. Elizabeth had given him an invaluable gift that filled him with an abundance of happiness he could not conceal. Darcy was painfully aware of the fact that she was merely toying with his affections, and so he reminded himself of the repercussions should his feelings get in the way. Yet he couldn't help but feel a strange hope bubbling up inside him. As Elizabeth evidenced moments of genuine sincerity, it presented him with a challenge he couldn't ignore. His well-honed mask of indifference served him well during those moments with her that threatened to betray her power over him. Yet, in his heart, he wanted something else, to take a risk and trust in what was forming between them. But then trepidation raced in, thoughts of being rejected and embarrassed by someone he had started to care for so deeply. Knowing, however, that the fate of their relationship lay as much in his own hands as in hers, Darcy steeled his resolve and took a leap of faith, ready to face whatever consequences came his way. Chapter 8. The Bennets of Longbourn had recently made the acquaintance of two very different gentlemen, Mr. William Collins and Mr. George Wickham. Mr. Collins made a quiet yet ostentatious entrance into the lives of the Bennet family. He was a proud, pompous man who was very self-absorbed and opinionated. He was determined to gain favour with the Bennet family and to prove his worthiness to the house of Longbourn, as he was the heir apparent. Elizabeth wanted nothing to do with him and avoided him to the best of her abilities. Mr. Wickham, however, was deemed far more agreeable. He was dashingly handsome, and possessed an air that set him apart from the other men in the militia encamped outside Meryton. Moreover, he was confident and approachable, quickly becoming a favourite of the Bennet family, especially the two youngest daughters, Kitty and Lydia. Mr. Wickham's presence was a breath of fresh air compared to the dullness of Mr. Collins. Even Elizabeth, who was not usually one to be swayed by physical appearance, was drawn to his allure and could not resist the charm of Mr. George Wickham. That evening Elizabeth was approached by Mr. Wickham at a small gathering at one of Longbourn's neighbouring estates. "You seem especially enamoured by my old friend Fitzwilliam Darcy," said Mr. Wickham, having dispensed with all the usual civilities. "He must have noticed me conversing with Mr. Darcy earlier," Elizabeth surmised. By then, Mr. Darcy and the rest of the Netherfield party had escaped, with the excuse of being expected elsewhere. Taken aback by her current companion's boldness, Elizabeth half smiled but stayed silent. Little did Mr. Wickham realise she meant to make Fitzwilliam Darcy fall in love with her, so she could later exact her revenge for his unjust opinion of her sister. She did not feel it was his place to know. "Old friend, you say? You two have a strange way of behaving toward each other. Neither of you has displayed any symptom of friendship based on my limited experience." Limited indeed. In fact, Elizabeth could recall having seen the two gentlemen in the same place at the same time only once before. It was during a brief encounter between the two on a Meryton street one day, during which the gentlemen scarcely, almost begrudgingly, acknowledged each other's presence. Mr. Wickham chuckled, his eyes still fixed on Elizabeth. "Let me explain, Miss Elizabeth. Despite appearances to the contrary, Darcy and I were reared side by side in his Derbyshire home, Pemberley. His excellent father was my godfather. He even left me a generous living in his last will, and a rather sensible arrangement, I must say. However, Darcy manoeuvred around it, so I did not receive the living in Kimpton after all. Can you imagine such audacity? I dare say I cannot, but as I do not know all the circumstances, I dare not pass judgment. In that same spirit, far be it from me to pass judgment on you either, Miss Elizabeth," he declared with a knowing smirk. "You are doing no less than can be expected of a young woman in want of a husband of consequence. Few men can resist the feminine allures of a young lady determined to do all the things to make a man fall in love with her." With a heightened colour and proper indignation, Elizabeth fixed Wickham with a look that spoke volumes. However, the words that left her lips were few. "I dare not speak to the depths of my own sentiments," she began hesitantly, "but I am certain they do not run in the direction you believe them to." Mr. Wickham observed Elizabeth's feigned indifference with a shrewd eye. He implored her not to fear, telling her she was only following a path many women had taken before her. To pacify her anxieties, he then suggested a course of conduct that women had used for centuries to win the affections of a man: to be coy and beguiling in her behaviour, to be vivacious and brilliant in her discourse, to be warm and amiable in her demeanour, free of any kind of reproach. Elizabeth's lips drew into a smile in response to the sage and genuine advice from Mr. Wickham. She expressed her sincerest gratitude for his thoughtful words, and conceded that she would reflect on the value of his counsel. However, Mr. Wickham could not stop there. He had another opinion to share with her. He proposed that a woman's greatest enchantment was to make a man feel indispensable. When a gentleman discerned his being brought happiness to a woman, that he would be her pillar of strength and reassurance. His heart's bonds would be unbreakable. Wickham's words had an immediate effect on Elizabeth. His implication that she should act the part of a damsel in distress to ensnare Mr. Darcy's affections was something she had never conceived of. She was initially sceptical of such an idea, but upon further contemplation she soon understood the art of Wickham's suggestion. Wickham further opined that if Mr. Darcy's heart remained hardened, Elizabeth should attempt to rouse his affections by making him envious, a plan that Wickham pronounced would be assured of success. He concluded nothing was more likely to arouse a man's heart than longing for what he could not have, even if he remained ignorant of the intensity of said longing. "Darcy hates me, and the thought of my possessing anything that he covets is unfathomable," Wickham concluded. Elizabeth's countenance softened at his evident distress, and she spoke with a gentleness she had not previously displayed. "Are you implying," she said earnestly, "that you would put yourself forward to make Mr. Darcy jealous?" There was a moment's silence before Wickham replied with a bow and a gracious smile. "I am your humble servant, madam," he said sincerely. Elizabeth raised her eyebrows, challenging Mr. Wickham with her stare. How could a man familiar with the gentleman under discussion be so willing to take part in such a plan? Could his character be so shallow, or was he simply desperate? What was in it for him? Wickham shifted uneasily under the scrutiny of her inspection. Elizabeth waited with an expectant silence for him to reveal his reasons. Then, after clearing his throat, he spoke about his opinion of Mr. Darcy. Mr. Wickham explained how his former friend, graced with impressive wealth, did not care for those he deemed beneath him in consequence, and often treated them with callous disregard. He shook his head disparagingly as he finished speaking, as if to make sure that no doubt remained as to his opinion on the matter. Elizabeth could not help but be sympathetic to Wickham's plight, and now saw in the lieutenant a kindred spirit. Both of them had suffered because of Mr. Darcy's callous disregard for the feelings of others. She could not deny feeling a modicum of gratitude toward Mr. Wickham. However, she gave no sign of agreeing with his proposal. It was, however, an interesting suggestion, one that made her ponder the possibility of Mr. Darcy feeling a pang of envy at the thought of her being the object of another man's attention. Could the prospect of her being with another man, even one whom Mr. Darcy regarded as inferior, be enough to make him jealous, to make him think twice about his feelings for her? She highly doubted a man such as Mr. Darcy, who had been so unkind to those of no consequence to him, would be affected by such a trifle. Yet, if this were to unfold, it would at least be some sign of her standing in his estimation. As far as she could discern, she had not yet made a dent in Mr. Darcy's seemingly impenetrable heart. Not wishing to reveal her thoughts to the gentleman, Elizabeth silently determined that she'd ponder his proposal. However, it would be some hours before she could decide whether his plan would benefit her. The night slowly advanced, and her heartbeat raced faster, anticipating the possibility of what could be. With Mr. Wickham's charm and my ingenuity, might this be the start of Mr. Darcy's downfall? Chapter 9. It was an undeniable truth that Elizabeth felt some measure of gratitude toward Mr. Wickham, despite not having agreed explicitly with his proposal. After all, he had offered her his assistance and insight in a quest that had yielded little progress. Indeed, she was intrigued by the plan Wickham proposed, which would allow her to gain Mr. Darcy's affection. As a result, she became increasingly drawn to it, even as her conscience reminded her that such tactics would be far from becoming in a proper young woman. Yet as she struggled to decide whether to embrace the scheme, Elizabeth found her resolve weakening, and her curiosity growing as she considered the implications of following through with the idea. Mr. Wickham's scheme is inherently duplicitous, but the thought of such behaviour stirring a reaction from the formidable Mr. Darcy is not without its allure. After much deliberation, Elizabeth surmised she could not realistically hope to gain Mr. Darcy's affection through traditional methods, not considering his staunch stance against those of lesser means, aspiring to a station beyond their spheres. Thus she concluded that this was her only hope of success. She had been standing by the window with a hopeful eye when she quickly ducked away upon spying the gentleman from Netherfield headed up the lane. The thrill of anticipation fluttered through her at the thought of what was about to unfold. With luck, Mr. Darcy would make some excuse to leave the room and come in search of her on the grounds, and then her plan to make him jealous of her affection for Mr. Wickham could be put into action. No sooner had she picked a single flower than she heard approaching footsteps. I knew the proud Mr. Darcy would not suffer being in the same room with my mother and younger sisters. A moment longer than necessary, Mr. Darcy cleared his throat, commanding her attention. "Miss Elizabeth," he began when her eyes met his, "I wondered if I would find you here." "Yes," she said, twirling the chrysanthemum she'd picked between her fingers. "I was walking about the garden in search of the perfect flower," she continued, her words intentionally loaded. "I was thinking of a certain gentleman of my acquaintance who would appreciate this token." If her actions had the intended effect, Mr. Darcy's demeanour showed no such symptoms. Taking a deep breath, she smiled and waited for him to respond. Instead, his face remained a mask of indifference, and Elizabeth's heart sank. Did he not understand her intentions? Did he simply not care? Their silence became deafening as she searched his expression for a hint of emotion. His silence compelled her to carry on with her performance. She took a few steps closer to him. "What say you, sir? Do you suppose Lieutenant Wickham would appreciate such a gesture?" There it was, the sign she had been hoping for. There was no mistaking the dark look that crossed Mr. Darcy's face at the mention of Wickham's name. A flush of elation rushed through Elizabeth. Mr. Darcy seemed to tense visibly, but it did not deter Elizabeth. She continued smiling slyly, and when he failed to respond, she stepped nearer and made a point of lingering ever so slightly closer to him than before. Though their eyes met, he seemed unable to find his words. Finally, with a struggle, he stammered out his response. "It appears you have attracted a suitor." He leaned forward slightly, scrutinizing her. His words, neither an accusation nor a compliment, hung in the air between them. Elizabeth felt a surge of power, a tingle of boldness at the thought of making him uncomfortable. With a tilt of her head, she replied, "I believe I have." The intensity of their gaze locked on each other increased, and Elizabeth suddenly became aware of her vulnerability. Part of her wanted to break away, but part of her wanted to stay. To feel this moment in the presence of this man she meant to bend to her will. Mr. Darcy's eyes searched her face, and Elizabeth felt her heart beating faster. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he spoke. "There is an old saying, Miss Elizabeth, be careful what you wish for." She thought to challenge him, but for once found herself with no clever retort. Instead, her senses heightened as the meaning of his words sunk in. Perhaps her plan was not as well conceived as she had thought, but on the other hand, Wickham's proposal seemed successful in evoking a reaction from Mr. Darcy. Be it jealousy or annoyance, she had aroused something in him, which, in Elizabeth's estimation, was better than nothing. "I must persevere. I must persevere." She opened her mouth to say something but could not find the words. Instead, she kept her eyes locked with his as the moment's intensity lingered. Thoughts of every second they had shared leading up to that point flashed through her busy mind. Finally he spoke, his voice firm. "It is dangerous to trifle with the sensibilities of others. The outcome may prove most unexpected." Elizabeth felt a blush rising to her cheeks. "I assure you, sir, I know precisely what I am about," she said. His eyes filled with consternation. Mr. Darcy nodded. "As you say, Miss Elizabeth, as you say," he said, and with that he turned and walked away. Elizabeth's heart raced as she watched the tall figure stride away from her, leaving her standing in the silent garden, the soft breeze caressing her face. Her goal had been achieved, and yet she felt a peculiar unease that left her pondering what had just happened between them. Unsettled by this, she reluctantly turned towards the house and slowly walked back, the heaviness in her stomach only increasing with each step. As Mr. Darcy walked away from Elizabeth, his mind raced. All he could think about was how she had looked standing there, the morning sun glinting off her dark curls. Her face was determined, her eyes intensely focused on him, challenging him. He had been taken aback by Elizabeth's boldness and blatant attempt to make him jealous. Though he was usually self-assured and composed, her teasing had thrown him off balance, and he was finding it difficult to regain his footing. How dare she toy with me in such a manner, he thought angrily. But even as he felt his anger rising, he could not deny the strange stirring of admiration at her courage in attempting such a ploy. That she had dared to trifle with him in such a manner roused something within him, something he could not name. Though the entire exchange left him unsettled, one thing was certain. Miss Elizabeth Bennet was a force to be reckoned with. "I have never been so bewitched by any woman as I am by her." He shook his head as if to temper his ever-increasing admiration. He knew that if he allowed himself to believe and hope for something more between them, he might set himself up for disappointment. After all, it was Elizabeth who had made the rules, and for the time being he was content to keep playing along, even as he knew all too well that love was not a game. Chapter 10. In eager anticipation of Jane's arrival, Mr. Bingley had greeted her the moment she descended from the carriage. Fate had conspired to keep the rest of her family, including Mr. Collins, at Longbourn that evening. How refreshing not to have her two younger sisters fawning over the amiable Mr. Wickham, at a time when she relied upon his employment in her scheme to make Mr. Darcy jealous. Charlotte had taken Elizabeth aside in the courtyard upon her arrival. She cautioned Elizabeth that she was not impressed with Wickham's inclusion in the scheme against Mr. Darcy, citing her distrust of the lieutenant as the basis for her wavering stance. What could Elizabeth say except that she had already cast the die? As for Jane's sentiments, they were much the same as they ever were. She did not suffer the slightest bit of resentment toward Mr. Darcy, even after Elizabeth gave her the strongest hint of Mr. Darcy's low opinion of her family in general, and Jane's prospects as a potential wife for his friend in particular. Jane much preferred to dwell on the good in Mr. Darcy instead. He was, after all, Mr. Bingley's closest friend, which must surely count for something in Jane's estimation. Alas, neither Charlotte's scepticism nor Jane's optimism could sway Elizabeth from her path. Soon enough, Elizabeth's senses stirred with anticipation as she entered the drawing-room of Lucas Lodge. With every step she could feel the presence of a tall and stately figure whose imposing air seemed to pervade the very atmosphere around her. Her heart raced as she gazed at the form of Mr. Darcy. He stood some distance away from her, surrounded by the Bingley sisters and Mr. Hurst. He turned to look at her, his expression unreadable, as though he was trying to decipher her thoughts. She felt her stomach flip and she quickly averted her gaze. Beside her, Mr. Wickham smiled, a mischievous glint in his eye. Time spent in company with him gave her reason to consider he was almost as enigmatic as Mr. Darcy himself. On the one hand, Elizabeth was a little surprised. She was somewhat confounded at Wickham's willingness to involve himself in such a farce, playing along as a potential suitor to her merely to make Mr. Darcy jealous. What could Wickham possibly hope to gain? On the other hand, as the scheme yielded fruit, Elizabeth did not mean to complain. She glanced again at Mr. Darcy and felt her heart beat faster. His gaze seemed to penetrate through her, and she bristled slightly, unused to such unwavering intensity. He stepped forward, then quickly stepped back as though some internal struggle had arrested him. Elizabeth felt a flush creeping up her neck and cheeks as she gazed into his eyes, dark and intense as a stormy sea. She dropped her eyes to the floor, not wanting to be pulled in deeper than she already was. At that moment, she felt something stir within her. She had struggled of late to ignore her feelings regarding Mr. Darcy and his mysterious nature, but now she could no longer deny them. She felt both attracted to him and resentful of him, and she could not decide which would prevail, or if perhaps there was a balance between the two. Elizabeth did her best to pay her full attention to Wickham, conversing with him on threadbare conversation and other mundane matters of no consequence. But try as she might, she could not forget the pair of dark eyes that seemed to follow her every movement. A wave of relief coursed through her when Lady Lucas called for the attention of all her guests and offered a momentary reprieve from Darcy's intense scrutiny. "It is with the utmost pleasure that I announce the commencement of supper," Lady Lucas exclaimed, her visage expressing her delight at the evening's feast. "If you would be so kind as to make your way to the dining-room and take your seats, we shall be able to begin." Elizabeth's eyes drifted across the room to where Mr. Darcy stood. As their eyes met for a fraction of a second, a strange sensation coursed through her being. She felt a blush developing on her cheeks. She quickly looked away, and noticing her discomfort, Wickham offered his arm, which Elizabeth gladly accepted as they followed Lady Lucas and the others into the hall. As Elizabeth took her place at the dinner table, her mind raced with recriminations and conjecture. She had assumed that feigning interest in Wickham while in Mr. Darcy's presence would be an easy task, but as she stole glances at Mr. Darcy throughout the meal, she realised it was not so simple. He seemed perfectly content being fawned over by the young woman beside him, Miss Caroline Bingley. No matter how hard Elizabeth tried to push the uninvited feelings away, she could not help but feel a pang of disappointment in her chest. The meal passed without incident, but Elizabeth became increasingly conscious of Mr. Darcy's presence. Despite their not exchanging so much as a single word during dinner, she felt connected to him in some odd way, as though their spirits communicated through the space between them. The thought confused and embarrassed her. After all, of what use could such a feeling be? Later that evening, while sitting with Wickham while others played cards, Elizabeth was so engrossed in her thoughts that she almost didn't hear Mr. Darcy's voice. "Miss Elizabeth," he said, his voice low and intimate, "would you care to take a turn on the terrace? I find a breath of fresh air is most refreshing after dinner." Elizabeth's heart slammed against her chest, but she forced herself to remain composed. She glanced at Mr. Wickham. "I suppose so long as my current companion does not object to the intrusion." Mr. Wickham's eyes widened in surprise, and then he gave a faint nod and stood to take his leave. He muttered something under his breath before turning and walking away without another word. Elizabeth felt Mr. Darcy's eyes linger on her momentarily before he stepped closer and offered her his arm. She accepted it, feeling strangely light-headed. The night was cool and crisp, the stars twinkling brightly above them, and the moonlight spilling over the landscape in a gentle glow. Elizabeth felt her heart pounding as she stepped out onto the terrace with Mr. Darcy, the stone floor chilly beneath her feet. She was aware of the warmth of his arm beneath her hand and the silence of the surrounding gardens. Neither of them said anything as they made their way along the terrace. The only sound was the gentle brushing of their feet against the stones. At last, Mr. Darcy broke the silence. "What have you been about all evening, Miss Elizabeth?" he asked, his voice low and tinged with annoyance and amusement. Elizabeth felt her cheeks grow hot, and she quickly averted her eyes. Her heart raced in her chest as she fidgeted with her fingers, her voice barely a whisper. I'm not sure what you mean," she stammered. Mr. Darcy chuckled softly. "Come now, Miss Elizabeth," he said. "I believe we both know what you are attempting to do." "I'm not sure what you mean," she repeated, her voice barely more than a whisper. "You're trying to make me jealous, are you not?" Elizabeth opened her mouth to speak, but a gentle pressure on her arm arrested her sensibilities. She looked up into Mr. Darcy's brooding eyes, her breath caught in her throat. His touch caught her off guard and sent a warm tingle down her spine, something she had never felt before. She could not identify the emotion, but it was strong and all-consuming. Elizabeth's cheeks flushed and she quickly looked away. She wanted to deny it, to deny that she'd been trying to make him jealous, but it was one of those rare times in her life when she couldn't find the words. Her chest felt tight and full of emotion, and she had no idea what to say or do. Mr. Darcy seemed to understand her turmoil, slowly moving his warm fingers up her arm, creating a pleasant tingle. He cupped her shoulder ever so lightly. Again she was surprised by his touch. Again she was unable to move away from it. A million thoughts and feelings raced through her mind, each more powerful than the last. As if remembering himself, he lowered his hand to his side, summoning her gaze. "Miss Elizabeth, this is not a game," he said, his voice deep and gentle. "I suspect that deep down you have feelings for me that you have not yet acknowledged or embraced." Elizabeth felt a sudden frisson spread through her body, and she could not help but shiver. For a moment a wild and reckless sensation that she had never suffered before overwhelmed her. But then she shook her head and forced herself to look away. "Mr. Darcy," she said tentatively. Mr. Darcy nodded. "It is fine," he whispered. "Love can be frightening, but it does not have to be. It can also be wonderful." Elizabeth felt her heart swell with emotion, and could not deny the truth of his words. "Yes," she whispered, "I suppose it can be wonderful." And at that moment, as Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy looked into each other's eyes, a spark of longing ignited between them. Elizabeth hung her head, afraid of what emotion she was revealing through her gaze. She desperately wanted to pour out all the warring sentiments inside her, all the reasons it ought to be impossible for her to love someone like him, how she could not help herself despite her better judgment. But she did not. She could not. "I must stick with my plan, if for nothing else than to prove that reason and conviction matter." Finally, Mr. Darcy cleared his throat and looked away, seemingly taken aback by his own boldness. Elizabeth was relieved that he wasn't pressing the issue, but at the same time she felt a twinge of disappointment that he wasn't fighting for her. She glanced up at him, and her treasonous heart leaped to see his eyes on her, watching her with an expression of tenderness and longing. For a moment neither of them said anything as they each waited for the other to take the lead. The tension in the air was palpable, and the awkwardness of their mutual unspoken affection for each other weighed heavily in their hearts. Mr. Darcy felt an overwhelming emotion bulge deep within. He had fought it for some time, but standing there in the moonlight with Elizabeth, he could deny it no more. He felt an impulse to reach out and take her hand, to tell her how much he cared for her, despite the differences in their station and her family's inferiority, their lack of fortune and want of connections. He wanted to tell her he loved, admired, and desired her, but even as the impulse took hold, he steeled himself and clutched his hands behind his back, knowing he must remain in control of his sensibilities. This game she was playing had yet to run its course, and although he wanted to give in to the longing that was bubbling inside of him, he knew he had to be strong. He looked away from Elizabeth, barely able to contain the mounting sentiments coursing through him. It was a strange feeling, a mixture of excitement, longing, and desire he had never felt before. It was a feeling that was both exhilarating and tormenting at the same time, Stubborn, impetuous, wilful woman were the words that came to mind as he contemplated how best to proceed. He steadied his chaotic thoughts and feelings before finally turning back to face her. "I think," he began slowly, letting the words linger before he continued, "it would be best to cease this game you're so intent on playing before either of us has cause for regret," he thought, but did not say. Instead, he remained resolute and did not give in to the longing threatening to overwhelm him, ever mindful of respecting Elizabeth's need for time to come to terms with her feelings. He leaned closer and continued, "I should escort you back inside." Chapter 11. Elizabeth's cheeks burned with delight as she conversed with her friends at the evening's gathering at Guildford Lodge, the home of one of the 24 families with whom her own family occasionally dined. The topic animating her lively spirits was the upcoming ball at Netherfield. She imagined the evening ahead, the ballroom alive with music, laughter, and the hum of conversation, and the chance to dance with the dashing lieutenant. George Wickham. Those gathered around, their eyes wide with anticipation, shared in her excitement, their faces filled with eagerness as they planned their ball attire, discussed their prospective dance partners, and exchanged gossip about the local goings-on. More than a few, including her younger sisters Kitty and Lydia, also mused aloud how wonderful it would be to stand opposite the handsome lieutenant. Lamenting the possibility that Elizabeth should be the one to command the greater share of his attention was the young girl's favourite refrain. The ball would be held in 2 days at Netherfield, and Elizabeth had already promised the gentleman the first set. She was sure he was looking forward to it just as much as she was, albeit for different reasons. Judging by the alacrity with which he played along with her scheme to make Mr. Darcy jealous, part of her could not help but think that she had captured a piece of Mr. Wickham's heart. Were she not intent on avenging her sister, Elizabeth thought she might easily capture all that remained uncaptured of Lieutenant Wickham's heart. The parlour of Guildford Lodge was a sight to behold, a warm and inviting space, with its light blue walls, swatches of gold-embroidered fabric adorning the deep blue couch and chairs, and the roaring fireplace in the room's corner flickering with warm, inviting flames. Fresh flowers were arranged in crystal vases along the window-sills and the sideboard, and their sweet scent filled the air. And, of course, much of the parlour was filled with excited chatter over the long-anticipated Netherfield ball. "Oh, I can hardly wait for the ball," Elizabeth said, her eyes sparkling with anticipation, upon later joining her sister, Jane, Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy, in another part of the room. "It will be so wonderful to dance with Mr. Wickham. I've promised him the first set, you know," she waxed poetic. She observed Mr. Darcy keenly. She could have sworn his features fleetingly betrayed a hint of dejection. Yet he composed himself in a matter of moments, his usual mask of indifference restored. Not to be deterred, Elizabeth gave Mr. Darcy a playful smirk and said, "I dare say I shall have my fill of dancing with Lieutenant Wickham. And you, Mr. Darcy, will you dance?" Mr. Bingley, whose jovial nature could scarcely be repressed, as he watched the interaction between Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth, said, "Come now, Darcy. You must dance as well. How else shall you win the heart of the fairest lady of the ball?" he grinned, and Elizabeth felt a blush rising to her cheeks at the jest. After a silent deliberation, Darcy said in a low voice, as if meant for her ears only, "If I should be so fortunate to encounter someone with whom I would find it a pleasure to stand opposite, as you no doubt have done, Miss Elizabeth, I would dare not hesitate." Elizabeth felt her cheeks flush with heat as his unexpected words registered in her mind. What can be his meaning in speaking so daringly? Is he finally showing his hand? She recalled when they were alone on the terrace at Lucas Lodge the last time they were in company, and how she was sure he had been on the brink of declaring himself. But, alas, he did not. Bending such a proud man to my will is the hardest thing I have ever set out to do, especially now that I find my heart and convictions in a constant battle. Yet I must persevere and ultimately prevail. With a pleasant smile, she said, "Then I shall look forward to seeing you on the dance floor, sir." "Oh yes, it shall be an evening of great merriment, I'm sure," cried Jane. Her voice cut through the air as she spoke, and all eyes turned to her. She smiled, hoping to ease the growing tension. Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy both glanced up at her but quickly looked away. Bingley concurred in the cheerful manner expected of him, and the air seemed to lighten a bit. Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy locked eyes, their gazes lingering and full of intensity. They both knew that no matter the outcome of their ongoing tussle, their battle of wills was far from done. Darcy's patience was waning. He knew Elizabeth was intentionally goading him, still attempting to make him jealous by mentioning Wickham's name. Still, he did not confront her about it. He knew she was nowhere near as enamoured of Wickham as she was pretending. At least, he hoped it was all a pretence. Part of her elaborate scheme to employ one of the oldest feminine tricks in the history of the world. It is too bad that Wickham is such a scoundrel, Darcy thought to himself. For all his charm and good looks, he is not one to be trusted. Elizabeth needed to know that before it was too late. But Darcy knew enough about her to know she would not believe a word against Wickham coming from him. He wished Wickham could be found out sooner rather than later and exposed for the scoundrel he was. But until then, Darcy was stuck pretending to be unaffected, while Elizabeth planned to dance the opening set of the upcoming ball with the man he despised. She was still chattering away with her sister and Bingley, but Darcy was barely listening. His focus never strayed from her, as if searching her every expression for a hint of her genuine feelings. Even if they both denied it, they shared a connection. He had spent so much time with her, getting to know her. Surely Elizabeth's feelings toward him couldn't be the same as when she'd concocted her scheme against him. He could feel himself being pulled towards her, wanting more despite his internal warnings to guard his heart. No matter how hard he tried to rein in his yearnings, Darcy knew he had developed deeper feelings for Elizabeth than he had thought possible. He longed to take her in his arms and end all the subterfuge, but for now he had to exercise extraordinary patience and wait for the right opportunity to reveal his feelings to her. Finally, the evening drew to a close, and Elizabeth pressed her lips together with a quiet sigh as she rose to leave. Only 2 days remain until the ball, she mused, looking to the group. What a treat it shall be. Elizabeth locked eyes with Mr. Darcy, her heart fluttering with a strange mixture of anticipation and trepidation. When he spoke, his words were laced with the promise of an evening far more diverting than the one she had dared dream of. "It shall indeed be as you say, Miss Elizabeth," he softly declared, offering her a small but promising smile. "I can hardly wait to meet my fated dance partner." Chapter 12. Mr. Wickham strode into the Netherfield drawing-room with a confidence that belied his unwelcome presence. His poise and bearing were perfect, yet the air of hostility was unmistakable, creating an atmosphere where all but Darcy felt the need to quit the room. When the two men were left alone, Darcy's glare fell upon Mr. Wickham. The intense animosity between them was almost tangible. With neither man needing to say a word to communicate their scorn, it was visible in their faces and eyes. Silence hung heavy between them, like a storm cloud ready to burst. It was a silence that simmered with tension, which only seemed to get thicker and more oppressive as Darcy and Mr. Wickham stared at each other in utter contempt. Clearly, Wickham no more wanted to be there than Darcy wanted him there, and yet he had come. Darcy's brow furrowed as he gazed into Wickham's eyes. What did he want after all that had passed between them? Money was Darcy's only explanation, and a wave of resentment surged in his chest. "Darcy, I need your help," Wickham said, coming straight to the point, his tone contradicting his confident air. "I've run up some debts with some of the local merchants, and I'm in danger of imprisonment if I do not soon pay them off, so I was hoping you might lend me some money to help pay them off." Years ago, Darcy made the disastrous mistake of enabling Wickham's irresponsible behaviour. Darcy's late father had stipulated in his will that Wickham would receive the living in Kimpton once it became available, but Wickham came to Darcy declaring that he wanted a large payout instead, which Darcy had agreed to, knowing Wickham was not fit to be a clergyman. Wickham had claimed he would use the money to study the law, but he squandered it instead, immersing himself in wasteful pursuits. It had been a hard and expensive lesson for Darcy, who had discovered firsthand that enabling Wickham's aimless lifestyle only guaranteed greater debauchery on the latter's part. Now Wickham was back, demanding more funds, and Darcy felt his stomach roil in disgust and anger. He remembered too well how Wickham had abused his father's trust, something Darcy had promised to uphold, yet here he was again with his hand out for more. "Do not be ridiculous. After everything you've done, you expect me to bail you out again. I'm no longer in the business of enabling your irresponsible behaviour." Come now, Darcy, we've known each other all of our lives. I'm sure you can spare a little money to help an old friend. An old friend? Is that what you consider me? After all the trouble you've caused, we're more like enemies. Darcy rolled his eyes. So what was it this time? How did you dupe everyone into handing over their money to you? I would not exactly use dupe to describe the opportunity I presented to them. You know how much I have always been fascinated with earning my fortune in mining. I became aware of a chance to invest in the possibility of a substantial return. Except I did not have the funds to do it alone, so I sought the support of one of the more prominent merchants in town. Before I knew it, merchants and gentlemen were seeking me out, practically handing their money over to me. What was I to do? Turn them away? Darcy demanded to know who Wickham had deceived, and Wickham handed him a list. Darcy's disbelief was heightened upon seeing the names of some of the most prominent gentlemen in that part of the country: Sir William Lucas, Mr. Phillips, Mr. Green, Mr. Bennet. Mr. Bennet, Elizabeth's father. Darcy's heart plummeted as he realised Wickham's deceit might injure the woman whom he held dear to his heart. Fury and indignation coursed through him as he stared at his former friend. So you found yourself with a hoard of money? What became of it? Why not simply return the money you collected? Do not tell me you squandered it. Tell me, was it at the gambling table or some other nefarious means? How could I not resist the temptation to double the money and carve out my stake? So you are saying you lost all the money? Despite any past misfortunes that may have transpired between us, my relationship with you is the closest thing to family I have. You can't turn your back on me, Darcy. I'm in trouble and I need your help. You know, if your excellent father, my godfather, were alive, he would not wish to see me suffer such a dire fate as the prospect of imprisonment. Darcy knew the sort of trouble that could befall anyone with debts unpaid. He heard this plea and saw the desperation in Wickham's eyes. He had little doubt that Wickham was telling the truth, and his heart softened slightly in sympathy. But he did not allow his sympathy to overwhelm his judgment, and he knew that he would have to devise a solution that would benefit both of them. "Despite our mutual animosity," Darcy began, "I am willing to help you on one condition." "Anything!" Wickham exclaimed. "Tell me what I must do and it will be done." "You must resign your commission, leave Hertfordshire, and accept a new commission in Newcastle. It's time to take responsibility for your actions and turn your life around." "Surely you jest! What you're proposing is absurd. Why would I behave so imprudently when I've finally found myself in a place where I can make something of my life?" Darcy harumphed. "Those are my terms, Wickham. I'm afraid I cannot help you if you're unwilling to accept them. It's time for you to face the consequences of your actions and make a fresh start, precisely what I am offering you a chance to do." Darcy watched Wickham, scrutinising his every gesture. He had to admit he pitied the man despite their previous troubles. He inhaled sharply as he felt an unfamiliar tug inside him. Was it compassion? Empathy? He shook his head and tried to push away such inclinations. This was Wickham, after all. "So this is how it's going to be, is it? Well, fine then. I'll resign from my commission and accept the new one in Newcastle. Even though you and I know what your sudden act of presumed benevolence is really about, I suppose I shall thank you all the same." Darcy made no response, which was encouragement enough for Wickham to continue. "You mean to place as much distance between Miss Elizabeth Bennet and me as you can. You need not deny it, for I know exactly what you are about. Whatever you imagine as being the reason makes no difference to me. So long as you abide by the agreement, I shall have no cause to repine. I'll see that all the arrangements to procure your commission in Newcastle are made post-haste, and even arrange your transportation. Prepare to leave by the end of the day. The sooner you are gone, the better, and not only for my sake, but for all the decent people in this part of the country." Darcy scrutinised Wickham as he left, uncertainty in his heart. Could this be the moment Wickham finally turned his life around and made the most of it? Darcy dared not hope too much, but with Wickham gone from Hertfordshire, he could not help but breathe easier. Despite their animosity, Darcy couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction at being able to help Wickham in his time of need. This was not the first time, but, with luck, it would be the last. "I believe I have fully honoured my excellent father, where his so-called godson is concerned. Wickham's fate is now in his own hands. Time would tell if Wickham could overcome his past mistakes and create a better future for himself, but for now, Darcy was quite contented. Newcastle, Darcy silently considered, throwing himself into a leather chair, leaning back and closing his eyes. A deep sigh escaped him. His lips twisted into an ironic smile at the thought of Wickham happily tucked away in some faraway place, a nuisance to no one but himself. Indeed, Wickham will be in nobody's way in that part of the country. Chapter 13. As Elizabeth and her sisters prepared for the ball, they discussed the likely candidates they would encounter, including the dashing Mr. Wickham. Elizabeth's eyes sparkled with excitement as she imagined standing opposite the handsome lieutenant for the opening set. The sisters hurried about in a flurry, their faces contorted in concentration, as they adjusted and secured their gowns and arranged their hair. While each sister took a moment to appreciate her own beauty in the mirror in their turn, they hastened on, their eyes lit with excitement as they exchanged quick glances. Even Mary was not immune to the infectious gaiety floating in the air. They stepped out of the house in unison, cradling one another's hands in support and anticipation, as they proceeded to the carriage, followed by a very proud mamma and a rather put-upon father. Their carriage arrived at Netherfield, and Jane and Elizabeth were the first to alight. They walked arm in arm into the grand hall while their parents and other sisters followed. Once the family had made their way through the receiving line, they went their separate ways. Elizabeth's eyes scanned the ballroom in one continuous movement. Light-coloured gowns and scarlet mixed with dark-hued coats blended together in a whirlwind as guests mingled, the same smiles, bows and curtsies pricking the sight like pins. The room spun in front of Elizabeth's eyes like a panorama of bright light, each figure slipping away just as it came into her view. None of the figures that passed were Mr. Wickham's, his face seemingly everywhere but just out of reach. The room hummed with voices and laughter, and the musicians tuning their instruments. She had so been looking forward to dancing the opening set with him, and seeing the look on Mr. Darcy's face in watching her do so. However, Mr. Wickham was nowhere to be found. Her disappointment was setting in when, suddenly the music and laughter faded away. Elizabeth only heard her quickening breath as she felt a presence behind her. Startled, she turned to find Mr. Darcy standing there in all his splendour, his finely tailored black suit a stark contrast against the attire of all the other guests. An emotion she could not discern overshadowed his face. Perturbation, perhaps, or longing. And yet his gaze held hers with an intensity that made her heart beat faster. "I could not help but notice, Miss Elizabeth, that you appear to be looking for someone," he said quietly, his voice evidencing an edge of amusement. "Might I be of assistance?" "Is Mr. Darcy laughing at me?" Elizabeth wondered. "You know very well that I promised Mr. Wickham the first set." Darcy threw a disinterested glance about the room. "And yet it appears the gentleman is nowhere to be found," he shrugged. "Imagine that." She raised her chin, an air of defiance surrounding her as she locked stares with him. "Is it because of you that Mr. Wickham is not here?" Darcy's expression didn't change, though Elizabeth could tell he was taken aback by her boldness. He studied her for a moment before speaking. "Perhaps that gentleman had more pressing matters than attending a ball," Elizabeth scoffed. "It is possible, I suppose. But it is not like him to break his word in such a way," she said, her voice a mix of disappointment and hurt. "I suspect other factors came into play," she stated pointedly, her voice filled with a hint of accusation. "Hence my earlier question. What did you do to keep Mr. Wickham away, Mr. Darcy?" Mr. Darcy looked away, seemingly unwilling to answer her question. When he finally spoke, his voice contained an air of sorrow. "You are disappointed Wickham failed to make an appearance, and rather than accept it for what it is, you blame me instead. He has told me about the past acrimony between you." "And?" Mr. Darcy asked, his brow arched. "I simply want the truth, Mr. Darcy," Elizabeth persisted. "Did you have a hand in keeping Mr. Wickham away from the ball? Is it because of your animosity toward him that he is not here? Or perhaps you were more bothered by the prospect of my dancing the opening set with the gentleman than you will confess. Hence you employed some stratagem or another to prevent it. It is as if you believe yourself to have a priority claim on my attention, which you certainly do not. I cannot countenance such an affront, and if you cannot explain yourself, you enjoy peculiar ideas where my thoughts and feelings lie regarding your potential dance partners." "That is not a denial on your part, sir. On the contrary, I dare say jealousy makes for a most unenviable companion. One might indeed say I had a part to play in the gentleman's absence this evening, but it has nothing to do with whatever fanciful notions you are entertaining regarding my supposed jealousy. That said, I dare not get into the details of Wickham's absence. But trust me, if you knew what that gentleman was really like, you would be thanking me, not begrudging me." Elizabeth's temper was rising with every moment. The thought that Mr. Darcy had used his power to turn the tables on her rattled her deeply. "Seeing that you have robbed me of my right to dance with my preferred partner, I have the right to know precisely why." Mr. Darcy held up his hand. "Miss Elizabeth, I never intended for you to be put out by my actions. I make no apology if you feel unduly slighted. Still, as I said, if you really knew the truth about that gentleman, you would know I acted out of concern for your best interests and that of your family, your neighbours, and indeed the entire town of Meryton." Elizabeth considered his words for a moment, her emotions still tumultuous. Then, after several moments of tense silence, she finally spoke in a calmer voice. "Is that all you mean to say in your defence, sir? Since when did you ever care about the feelings of those so far beneath you in circumstances? Is this really your opinion of me? I would have you believe otherwise. If I had nothing more than personal concerns, I would never have acted as I did regarding George Wickham. My actions were taken to ensure the well-being of everyone in Meryton from a man who was not what he seemed. Sir, you will forgive me for being circumspect, I pray, but whatever the circumstances, what is done. We can both agree that this conversation is too weighty for a ballroom." "Indeed," Mr. Darcy said. He paused and then offered his arm. "And circumstances being as they are, shall we begin the evening anew by your granting me the honour of the opening set with you?" Elizabeth gave him a strange look. Was he really asking her to dance after everything that had just unfolded? Mr. Darcy seemed to understand her confusion, for he smiled faintly. "I know that, under the circumstances, this is asking a great deal of you, but I would be honoured if you would accept my invitation." Ever cognizant of her primary aim of making the gentleman jealous, which appeared to have worked as evidenced by his sending the competition away, Elizabeth did not mean to squander her advantage by being too contrary. Despite her conflicting sentiments and growing awareness of the gentleman's many amicable qualities, Elizabeth was very aware of his less than amiable propensities, particularly his callous disdain for those he considered beneath him in consequence, not to mention his heartless words about Jane. Here was a man who disposed of his foes with little, if any, trouble to himself and even less contrition. Although she could say her heart had never been touched by Mr. Wickham, who was to say that it would not have been at some point in the future? And had she known what Mr. Darcy was capable of, she was sure she would never have agreed to Wickham's scheme. Upon looking into Mr. Darcy's eyes, contemplating her next move, Elizabeth couldn't help but be slightly encouraged by his offer. Perhaps he was more in her power than she had previously thought, a factor she would use to her advantage when the perfect opportunity presented itself. Any discomfort she felt about going through with her plans to humble him was overshadowed by thoughts that such a man might very well be incapable of humility. Finally, she graciously accepted the offer. "I would be delighted," she replied, soft and sincere. The two shared a brief smile before they stepped out onto the dance floor. Then, as they began their dance, Elizabeth felt the slightest of tensions ease between them. She almost felt like the two were communicating, exchanging silent secrets, unspoken challenges, and possibly even more. The dance concluded, leaving Elizabeth with a multitude of feelings. Wickham's conspicuous absence and Mr. Darcy's confounding role in the mystery of his whereabouts weighed heavily on her mind. Yet, a strange sense of contentment coursed through her veins as her imagination ran wild with anticipation of what further surprises the night had in store. Chapter 14. The Netherfield ball was in full swing and the Bennet family was the centre of attention. As Miss Kitty and Miss Lydia busily flitted about with their frivolous amusements, Miss Mary's rendition on the pianoforte was one that even the most forgiving critics would have deemed wanting. Not to be outdone in lack of taste, her father did the young woman's exhibition no justice, by urging her to seek other employment. To add further to Mr. Darcy's already poor opinion of the Bennets, the ridiculous parson visiting the Bennets had introduced himself. He owed it to doing the bidding of Darcy's aunt Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who, as it turned out, was the vicar's benefactor. What a ridiculous man, to be sure, Darcy considered. He wondered if any of Elizabeth's relations might be deemed estimable, compared to his own lofty acquaintances. He quickly put the matter out of his head, and turned his attention back to the ballroom. Darcy had taken refuge on the sidelines of the dance floor, from where he could observe Elizabeth unnoticed. He could barely keep his eyes off her. As she moved gracefully through the throng of people, the liveliness of it all invigorated her. Darcy felt his admiration grow with each passing moment. At one point he found himself standing close to Mrs. Bennet and her friend Lady Lucas. He began listening to their conversation, hoping to learn more about the second eldest Bennet daughter. "Oh yes," Mrs. Bennet declared. Then her face lit up with smug satisfaction. The woman proudly lifted her chin and proclaimed, "The amiable Mr. Collins has promised to offer his hand in marriage to my second eldest daughter." Darcy felt his heart lurch in dread at her words, and his face coloured with silent anger. "Oh my!" Lady Lucas exclaimed. "That is quite a blessing for the Bennet family indeed. But do you really suppose she will accept him? We both know how stubborn Lizzie can be, but in the end she always does what is best for her family. Indeed, I am sure she will make an excellent mistress of Longbourn when the time comes. But for the time being, I am sure my Lizzie will be perfectly contented at her new home in Hunsford." "Just as your eldest daughter is soon to become the mistress of Netherfield, I suspect," Lady Lucas replied with a nod. Mrs. Bennet's voice rose excitedly. "Indeed," she exclaimed, her expression full of pride. "My eldest will soon be the wife of our dear Mr. Bingley. The way he dotes on her warms my heart. You are aware that he gave this extravagant ball in my Jane's honour, are you not?" She clasped her hands together, her face beaming and her voice rising in pitch. "His generousness in hosting this magnificent ball in our daughter's honour is a testament to his feelings for her." Darcy stood silently in the corner, his heart filled with annoyance and dread. The thought of Mr. Collins' proposal to Elizabeth proving successful gave him a feeling of deep distress. Though he had to put on a brave face, his heart was heavy with worry and fear of losing Elizabeth forever. With a deep sigh, he swiftly yet unobtrusively departed from the room, trying to keep his sadness from view. Mr. Darcy marched resolutely from the ballroom, his shoulders forced back, though the burden of his reflections weighed heavily upon him. His chest tightened at the thought of Elizabeth marrying another, someone so undeserving and puffed up with himself. Even if Collins is an excellent match for one of the Bennet daughters, what with his being the heir of their family's estate, a union between him and Elizabeth would subject her to misery of the acutest kind. She deserves so much more. Marriage to a gentleman she can love, honour and respect, one who will cherish, worship, and adore her. A man like me. Darcy's mind was full of reflections on how much he loved Elizabeth. He loved everything about her, her wit, her beauty, her strength. The prospect of losing her to Mr. Collins was intolerable. Darcy felt he had no choice but to put his pride and his judgment of her family aside if he wanted to secure her as his wife. With a new sense of determination and conviction, he understood that the only way to guarantee their future together was to offer his hand in marriage to her. He squared his shoulders and stepped back into the ballroom. It had not escaped his notice that the ridiculous man had spent most of his evening in Elizabeth's general proximity. Now he knew why. He knew he had to act quickly before Mr. Collins could make his offer, so he set out to find Elizabeth. He spotted her in the centre of the room and promptly approached her side. She was standing beside her friend, Miss Lucas. He bowed his head in greeting the latter before meeting Elizabeth's puzzled stare. Then, with a hint of nervousness, he asked, "Miss Elizabeth, I was wondering if I could have a private audience with you." Blushing, Elizabeth consented, excused herself from her friend, and soon Darcy and she were walking down a long hallway, away from the clamour of the ballroom. When they were alone, Darcy stopped and looked Elizabeth in the eye. "Miss Elizabeth, I find myself in a difficult situation. I know that some members of my family, indeed society in general, would disapprove. Many, myself included, would consider our union to be a most improper one. Yet I can no longer deny I am in love with you and wish to make you my wife." Elizabeth gasped in surprise, and Darcy took this opportunity to continue. He started off by confessing his reservations and articulating the reasons they should not marry. He detailed his misgivings about her family and how they were a source of great trepidation. Still, he told her he had eventually cast all those concerns aside. Then, with a profound and burning desire, he said, "All this I have weighed against my deep admiration for you, and have found the outcome significantly in your favour. I shall not pretend such a decision is without its share of difficulties, but I will face them with you. It is my deepest desire that you will find it in your heart to accept my proposal of marriage." He stepped closer and took one of her hands in his, squeezing it gently. "I love you, most ardently, Miss Elizabeth. Will you consider sharing the rest of your life with me? Will you marry me?" She removed her hand in haste. The last thing in the world Elizabeth had expected that night was Mr. Darcy's proposal, especially given the start of their evening and the lingering ill will she suffered toward him for what she insisted was his officious treatment of Leeton Wickham. However, the manner of his proposal made it easier for her to carry forth her scheme than she had feared. The persistent thought of her injuring the man who had come to mean more to her than she thought possible had taken its toll on her equanimity of late. His speech, however, had made for 2 blows in a few hours. Elizabeth knew his overbearing pride had driven him to make such an appalling offer, turning her slowly garnered, though carefully concealed, affection for him into disdain for him with each passing moment. She stepped back, a scowl on her face. "Mr. Darcy, I must say that your offer of marriage is quite unexpected, as well as unbecoming of a gentleman of your standing," she said, her voice cold and emotionless. His body as still as a statue, his eyes wide with disbelief, Mr. Darcy asked, Are you rejecting me?" "You have given me no other choice. Might I ask why, and with such little consideration?" "Sir, despite expressing your ardent admiration for me, you appear to have done so against your better judgment. If that were the only reason, but you must know it is not. It is not just your undisguised disdain for my family, but for Jane in particular. Do you truly expect me to accept the hand of a man who would seek to ruin the happiness of a most beloved sister? Your sister seems perfectly contented to me. To hear your mother speak of the matter, there is to be a wedding here at Netherfield in no time at all. Not that you did not do everything in your power to prevent it. Indeed, sir, I heard it all that day in the library when you tried to persuade Mr. Bingley to set his sights elsewhere. Was I really so wrong in pointing out the disadvantages of his rushing into such an unequal alliance with someone whose family lacks fortune, connections, and is so wholly in want of proper etiquette and decorum?" Then, bolstering his convictions, he added, "Just this evening alone, this entire gathering bore witness to the appalling spectacle of your mother, 3 younger sisters, and even your father, serving as a prime example of what I meant to steer him clear of. Toward Bingley I have been kinder than I have been toward myself. The fact is, I can weather the burden that is sure to result from an unequal alliance far better than a man like Bingley." His lips twitched, almost in defiance. "What kind of friend would I be to have comported myself without regard for his future?" Elizabeth scoffed. "And we both know what kind of friend you can be." "What does that mean?" "Did you not once consider yourself a friend of Mr. Wickham's? You take an eager interest in that gentleman's affairs," he argued, stepping closer to her. "Who that knows of his misfortunes would not? First, you deprived him of the living that should have been his, reducing him to comparative poverty. Then, when he finally established a solid footing as a lieutenant in the militia, you contrived to have him sent away. I know it all, sir. No thanks to you, I might add." "What exactly do you think you know?" "I know from speaking with his friend Mr. Denny this very evening. I know you are behind Mr. Wickham's resigning his commission with the local militia, and forcing him to settle for another far, far away in Newcastle. Heaven knows why you would do such a thing. I can only suppose your reasoning would redound to your own self-interest, and entirely to his detriment. It would appear your grievances against me are quite severe. Is there anything more you wish to share with me, or have you exhausted every excuse at your disposal for behaving so injudiciously? Pardon me, sir, but I do not consider refusing the proposal of a man who harbours such a selfish disdain for the feelings of others, and does not hesitate to act upon said feeling as injudicious." "Is this really your opinion of me? Has the time we have spent together meant nothing to you?" "I would not say it meant nothing, only that it did not mean enough. More than anything, I have to remain true to myself and my convictions," Elizabeth said, her voice a mixture of determination and the slightest measure of contrition. Darcy's heart sank with disappointment and a hint of despair. Feeling exposed and rejected, he struggled to keep his facade of composure. Riddled with confusion, disbelief and resignation, he swallowed hard. "I see," he uttered in a strained voice. "Then please accept my sincerest apologies for taking up so much of your precious time." Mr. Darcy's eyes burned and his countenance hardened. He uttered not another word. Instead, he turned away and began his hasty retreat. What would come of this tragic parting? He knew not what the future would bring. But in view of all the tumult in his mind, having gambled on the prospect of winning Elizabeth's good opinion and her heart, and failing miserably, he frankly did not care. Chapter 15. The Bennet ladies congregated in the parlour, their conversations and laughter filling the air with blissful harmony. They recounted the events of the Netherfield ball, each so excited over the prospect of what the next such occasion would bring. But out of nowhere, the door swung open, and in waltzed Mr. Collins, his regard immediately fixating on Elizabeth. All eyes were on him as he advanced upon Elizabeth, his expression concentrated and focused. Everything else in the room dulled compared to his purposeful movements. Even the laughter and conversation that had occurred before had ceased, leaving an odd sense of anticipation as he steadily approached her. An omen of bad things to come, in Elizabeth's view. "Miss Elizabeth," he said, and the Bennet women all froze. "I was hoping to have a word with you, in private, if possible." Elizabeth's cheeks burned as she felt all eyes focused on her. The idea of having a private conversation with the ridiculous Mr. Collins was both appalling and vexing. She opened her mouth to protest, but was cut off by her mother's piercing voice. "Come, come, girls," Mrs. Bennet said with an air of warmth and hospitality that seemed out of place in the current situation to Elizabeth's way of thinking. "Let us leave Mr. Collins and our dear Lizzie to themselves." A deafening chorus of whispers and rustles of fabric filled the room as the sisters prepared to take their leave. Elizabeth's heart slammed wildly against her chest as she watched them. She wanted to cry out and tell them to stay, but her lips were frozen in astonishment. Each step they took felt like a stab in her heart as they made their way out one by one, leaving her alone with the ridiculous Mr. Collins. An eerie silence descended on the room, and a chill ran through Elizabeth's body, leaving goosebumps in its wake. The air seemed to sink and curl around her, as if it was alive and trying to protect her from what was to come. She could feel his eyes searing into her, as if he was trying to read her thoughts and capture the depths of her soul. His mouth parted and closed again several times as though he struggled to find the right words. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of silence, he spoke. "Cousin Elizabeth," he began softly, "I have come here with the utmost humility and respect to ask for your hand in marriage." Elizabeth's eyes widened in surprise and her mouth hung open in shock as she gasped. She was still reeling from her unfortunate encounter with Mr. Darcy, and now this. It felt as if fate had a hand in all of it, that the stars had aligned and conspired to bring her to this surreal yet real moment. Mr. Collins's face lit up with hope as he mistook Elizabeth's lack of words as encouragement. "I'm sure you've heard of my current situation," he stated, casting a fleeting glance over Elizabeth's face. "I need a wife, and you, my dear, are the most suitable candidate," he declared with a hint of finality. Her eyes widened in disbelief. Mr. Collins couldn't possibly be serious. But as he continued to badger her with his proposal, it became clear that he was deadly serious. Mr. Collins had chosen her, and she felt rather bewildered. Why not one of her 4 sisters? I would not wish such a foolish man on anyone I love, but why me? She could imagine Jane's sweet and soft-spoken acceptance, Mary's dutiful deliberation, Kitty's resigned delight, or even Lydia's girlish pride at the accomplishment of besting her older sisters. Yet, there she was, the chosen one. Elizabeth sifted through these disturbing conjectures in utter vexation until her confusion overwhelmed her. She gazed longingly out the window. It was as if she were summoning a knight to come and rescue her from the perils of her current circumstance, which called to mind Mr. Darcy's proposal. It might have been a moment of true romance, unlike this current unfolding travesty, so sure of his affections as Mr. Darcy had shown himself to be, and yet doomed to fail, owing to Elizabeth's preconceived scheme. With a heavy sigh, Elizabeth tore her eyes from the window and paced the room. She felt like a caged animal, searching desperately for an escape from such an unenviable fate. She listened as Mr. Collins droned on, his words washing over her like a relentless wave. She grew increasingly agitated with every passing word, and soon she could no longer take it. Finally, she slowly turned toward Mr. Collins. She eyed him warningly as he looked at her, a hopeful expression on his face. Then, taking a deep, steadying breath, Elizabeth ended the madness and declared, "I'm sorry, Mr. Collins, but I cannot accept your proposal." Mr. Collins was dumbstruck. He had clearly not expected such a refusal. He spoke a few more words, each more desperate than the last, to entice her. Yet Elizabeth's resolve remained unaltered. She hastily excused herself and dashed out of the room with conviction, having already made her decision and determined to adhere to it. She was filled with a powerful mix of vexation, dread, and distress in the incident's aftermath. Her entire body shook as her mother's anger filled the air. Tears welled in her eyes, and a tight compression of anguish encompassed her chest. She tried to explain why she felt so strongly about the situation, but her mother kept cutting her off mid-sentence, insisting that Elizabeth was obstinate, foolish, and selfish, and that she cared nothing about the feelings of others and thought only of herself. Just as Elizabeth felt she couldn't take it anymore, her father stepped in. His strong arm around her shoulders and soothing words of understanding did more to ease her burden than anything else. He seemed to know that, though his wife was suffering under the weight of disappointed hopes and dreams for their family, his daughter needed him more. Elizabeth felt relieved and clung to him like a life raft, grateful for his presence and unwavering support. The following morning, Mrs. Bennet's animosity towards Elizabeth had not subsided, and it had also infected Mr. Collins. Elizabeth had hoped that his resentment might shorten his visit, but his plan did not appear in the least affected by it. He was always to take his leave on Saturday. Until Saturday he meant to stay. On what they presumed to be a more positive note, a letter from Netherfield arrived for Miss Bennet with a delicate seal on its envelope. All eyes shifted towards Jane as she opened it, and perused it with excitement radiating from her face. It was from Caroline Bingley. With bated breath, Elizabeth and her family eagerly waited for the contents of the letter to be revealed. "Dearest Jane, I hope this letter finds you in good health and spirits. As for myself, I write to you with great sadness and longing. It has been a trying past few days, despite our endeavours to remain in good spirits. After a successful evening at the ball, my brother and Mr. Darcy left Netherfield in the early morning hours. Now we are all in a state of confusion and despair, for the latter's departure was most unexpected. Mr. Darcy takes such prodigious care of my brother, which must undoubtedly explain his last-minute decision to return with him to town. Why, what other reason can his leave-taking in such haste be? Mr. Darcy is nothing if not steadfast. Such a precipitous departure is not typical of him indeed. Can you surmise how distraught we are by his absence? I dare not lament it further. Now that Louisa and I are deprived of two of our most esteemed companions, we miss both of them deeply, and wish you to share the pleasure of your company with us. Therefore, I humbly ask if you could spare some time from your own affairs to join us at Netherfield. I am certain it would delight Charles if you could join us. I hope you can find it in your heart to accept our invitation. Do write informing us of the earliest convenient time for you to join us, and we shall send a carriage to collect you. Recall your last visit to Netherfield and your subsequent ill health. Heavens forbid that a similar fate should befall you once again. Why, my brother would never forgive us, especially with his being so far away in town. Nor would my sister and I forgive ourselves. I await your response with eager anticipation. Yours truly, Caroline Bingley." Perhaps the invitation that Jane had received was a sure sign of the Bingley sisters' fondness. Amid Elizabeth's heavy heartache, she thought of the joy it must have brought to Jane. She longed to delight with Jane in the prospect of her relationship with the Bingley sisters, and what it must indeed portend for her relationship with the brother. Still, she was met with a timely reminder of the one relationship that she had so carelessly discarded. Elizabeth's spirits had sunk within her upon learning of Mr. Darcy's leave-taking, and the diminished probability that they would ever see each other again. Her heart ached at the thought of him, the thought of missing him, and her conscience stung by the remembrance of the part she had played in this conclusion. Nevertheless, she held fast to her resolve. No matter the cost, she was determined to remain true to herself. Elizabeth's thoughts returned to Mr. Darcy. She prayed that, if nothing else, his absence would make her forget and thus make her resolve easier to bear. Chapter 16. Elizabeth carefully pressed herself against the wall, standing in the dimly lit shadows of the hallway outside her father's study. She could hear her father and Uncle Philip's low, mumbling conversation, as they discussed Mr. Darcy and his part in the new commission for Wickham. Their voices grew louder, and Elizabeth heard an uncomfortable chuckle as they discussed the cost of the commission. Her heart thudded against her chest as they pondered the amount Darcy must have paid, before they both murmured in agreement that it must have cost him dearly. He must have laid upwards of £10,000 on the scoundrel. "Oh, at least," the other gentleman conceded. Determined to know more, Elizabeth waited in the adjoining room, safe from view until her uncle was gone. At first she hesitated at the door, her hands clutched together to calm her busy mind. At length she closed her eyes, steeled herself, and let out a slow, steady breath, before opening the door to her father's study. Taking tentative steps into the room, she paused and noted her father's mahogany desk in the centre of the room, surrounded by bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes. The slight scent of pipe smoke lingered in the air. She swallowed hard and mustered her courage before finally asking her father the details of Wickham's misdeeds and the magnitude of Mr. Darcy's gesture. After stalling, Mr. Bennet said, "You take a peculiar interest in this affair. I cannot help but wonder which gentleman's part concerns you most." Mr. Bennet was an odd mixture of quick parts and dry wit. Having no doubt read the confusion on his daughter's face, he took pity on her and began recounting Wickham's scheme. The dashing Lieutenant Wickham outlined a very logical and concise business proposal. Then he regaled us with stories of all his past successes and how his plan would bring great wealth without any risk, Mr. Bennet said. It seemed like a perfectly safe investment, so we all quickly agreed and handed him over a generous sum of money to get started. Wickham thanked us for our trust and bowed, leaving us filled with hope and optimism. But unfortunately, he had no intention of investing the money. Instead, he had planned to gamble it to make enough money to pay all the so-called investors back and pocket the difference. But the gamble failed miserably, leaving Wickham in debt to all of us. Concluding his speech, Mr. Bennet nodded. Yes, Mr. Wickham made love to us all with glorified, honey-laced words and promises of untold felicity aimed at separating us from our money. But for the generosity of Mr. Darcy, we would all be akin to jilted lovers. As Elizabeth listened to her father's recounting of Wickham's deception, she held her breath, a mix of emotions coursing through her, frustration, regret, disbelief, and even admiration. Then a wave of guilt washed over her. She had been so caught up in her pride and prejudice, and her thirst for vengeance that she had failed to see the truth of who Mr. Darcy really was. As her father spoke, she reflected on all the conversation she had shared with Mr. Darcy, and the many times she had praised Wickham in his presence. Her father was correct. Mr. Darcy had saved them all from the consequence of Wickham's scheming. He had spared them from the humiliation and financial hardship of having been duped. But more importantly, he had done it without fanfare or recognition, expecting nothing in return. Elizabeth could not help but admire his selflessness and generosity. Mr. Darcy's words at the Netherfield ball to trust him had taken on a new meaning. He had not been asking her to trust him as a romantic interest, but as a friend and protector. He had not expected her to believe it right away, but he'd hoped she would understand in time. The realization caused Elizabeth's heart to ache. She had thought the worst of Mr. Darcy for far too long, and she had been so wrong. Finally, she began to understand why he had behaved the way he did. He had been trying to protect her from Wickham and the consequences of his actions. Mr. Darcy meant to shield me from the unpleasantness of it all by not revealing Wickham's duplicity. She felt ashamed and embarrassed for her own behaviour. Until this moment, I never really knew myself. From the very start, how woefully misguided my opinion of Mr. Darcy has been. He is not disdainful and unfeeling. On the contrary, he is honourable and generous. Had it not been for Mr. Darcy's kind and noble heart, the townspeople, her own family included, would have suffered dramatically from Wickham's misdeeds. Mr. Darcy had not sought glory or recognition, but had done what was right, and for people so wholly unconnected to him no less, making her consider, if only for a fleeting moment, that he had done it for her. Elizabeth knew she could not undo the past. Still, she wanted Mr. Darcy to know his actions were not unappreciated. Her thoughts swirled, conjuring a vision of a reunion with the man she had misjudged, a secret longing that had always been in her heart, but now held even more power over her. The temptation of his memory surged within her like a crashing wave, and she felt her spirits rising to hopefulness. But at the same moment she felt a gripping fear as she confronted the reality that such an encounter could never be possible. Contradicting sentiments battled within her, wanting to see him again, and fearful of the consequences that could come from it. Her eyes brimmed with hope, but her stomach clenched as her memory of the scarred path of their past grabbed hold of her. She swallowed hard, steeling herself against the uncertainty that surged through every fibre of her being. If mercy ever crossed his mind and he saw fit to forgive her for the wrong she had done against him, Elizabeth vowed to make up for it in the manner that only a grateful heart can bestow. Chapter 17. Elizabeth was still deep in thought later that night. Her mind and heart were in turmoil, replaying the events of the afternoon, the shock of her father's story and the realization of her misguided prejudice. She was filled with shame and self-reproach for what she had mistakenly assumed of Mr. Darcy. The following morning she found a reprieve from the tumult in her mind with a visit from her intimate friend Charlotte. The ladies strolled arm in arm around the garden, basking in the autumn sun's warmth and breathing in the sweet fragrances of the season. Elizabeth delightedly observed the colourful flowers and foliage that gave the garden its quaint charm. Charlotte, fond of nature, commented on the beauty of the plants. At that moment time stood still, allowing the lifelong friends to enjoy nature's beauty and tranquillity. Days had passed since Elizabeth had rejected Mr. Collins's marriage proposal, and it was time to discuss the events that had unfolded since she and her friend last spoke that evening at the Netherfield ball. No, not the part about her refusal of Mr. Collins's offer of marriage. Thanks to Mrs. Bennet's incessant prattling, Elizabeth had no doubt that the whole affair was now gossiped about in the neighbourhood. But what had happened the night before, Elizabeth had kept secret, even from her sister Jane. She turned to her friend and said, "Dearest Charlotte, there is something I must tell you." Elizabeth's tone was serious and her eyes were focused on the ground beneath her feet as she gathered her thoughts. Charlotte was patient, offering an encouraging word for her friend to take her time. Elizabeth took a deep breath before she spoke, uncertain how to begin. She finally recounted how Mr. Darcy had proposed to her, only for her to reject him in keeping with her predetermined scheme. Her voice shook and her eyes glazed over with sadness as she recalled the night's events. She tried brushing off the wave of regret that had taken over her heart. She managed a weak smile as she concluded the story, painting a bleak picture, describing the way Mr. Darcy's face filled with abject disappointment and sadness as she uttered the last words a man who fancied himself in love could ever want to hear from the object of his affection's mouth. "Oh, Elizabeth," Charlotte said softly, looking at her with surprise laced with confusion. She hesitated for a moment before continuing. "This is all so strange. So you had your revenge, which was a success, but at what expense?" Elizabeth sighed and shrugged. "At the cost of my own heart, I fear," she said, unable to deny the truth of her words. "It was the right thing to do. I had no other choice," she murmured, almost desperately trying to believe the words pouring from her lips, and attempting to cover up her rising guilt for manipulating another's feelings, even if it was for a just cause. Charlotte patted Elizabeth's hand in a gesture of understanding. "I know this was a hard call for you to make," she said. "It's not easy to stand up for what you believe in, but you faced the challenge, and I applaud your strength." Her chest rose slowly as she inhaled, her body seeming to pause momentarily as if gathering strength. "And now," she began, "I have exciting news. I hope you will be happy for me." Elizabeth was watchful of her friend, whose countenance had taken on a hint of discomfort and apprehension. "Charlotte, whatever you are thinking about, please share it with me," she said encouragingly. The pause felt like a brief eternity that weighed over the conversation before she finally continued. "I have accepted Mr. Collins' proposal. We are to be married." At first, Elizabeth could not believe what she was hearing. Yet she could not help but consider what if Mr. Collins had been of a mind to offer his hand to her a second, or even a third time. A momentary sense of confusion washed over her. It was as if circumstances had snatched away her last chance of avoiding spinsterhood in an instant. As if Charlotte's acceptance of Mr. Collins's proposal was fate's scheme to keep Elizabeth from matrimony in retaliation for how she had treated Mr. Darcy. If the thought of her intimate friend being married to such a ridiculous man was not so senseless, Elizabeth would surely have laughed at her own misfortune. This was Charlotte, after all. Charlotte, a level-headed and clever woman, had made a startling decision that would determine the course of her life. Elizabeth gave her a look filled with disapproval. "What are you thinking, Charlotte?" she said. "As the most sensible one between us, why would you marry a man you don't know? What could possess you to do such a thing?" "I know it may seem sudden," Charlotte began, fidgeting with her hands, "but I was offered a great opportunity and, well, I really don't think I'll ever have a chance like this again." Charlotte's cheeks flushed with embarrassment and she gave a little shrug. "I know it might seem strange," she said, "but I think it is to be a prudent arrangement. I am getting older, and I need stability and security in my life. I trust Mr. Collins and believe he will be a good caretaker." Elizabeth nodded, understanding that Charlotte was trying to secure an advantageous future for herself. She reached out and took her friend's hands in her own. "I understand why you would make this decision, and I will not judge you for it," she said gently. "I only wish you the best. I will always be here for you if you ever need me, just as you have always supported me." Charlotte felt a weight leaving her heart as Elizabeth embraced her. There was a deep sense of joy that the familiarity of her friend's touch brought her, and she knew their bond could never be broken. Her decision to help her family, despite the fear of an uncertain future with Mr. Collins, left her feeling grateful and determined. She recalled her philosophy on her impending journey. Happiness in marriage is entirely a matter of chance. The two parted ways, sharing a smile and a silent promise that their friendship would remain strong. Charlotte knew she had made the right choice. If only her intimate friend's heart could be filled with the bliss that Charlotte herself was suffering, that surely would be the height of felicity. Chapter 18. Darcy House, London, England. Bingley stood awkwardly in the centre of Darcy's vast London townhouse, a feeling of dread slowly settling in. His usual confidant friend, with his steely glare and unyielding stature, had always been intimidating. But now, as he watched Darcy's eyes pierce into him, the gravity of Bingley's question seemed crushing. He had agonised over this decision since he first realised his love for Jane Bennet, and had clung to that shred of hope that, despite their initial disagreements, Darcy would come to accept his choice. Bingley inhaled deeply, his chest swelling with determination, and his voice rising with every word he spoke. "Are you still opposed to the idea of my marrying Jane? Even my sisters, who were at first as fiercely against the idea as anyone could be, have agreed not to stand in my way." His back straightened as he stiffly awaited Darcy's answer. His eyes nervously darted across the room but quickly returned to the other man. Mr. Darcy's countenance was a mask of sternness, and a prevailing sense of tension hung heavily in the air. Then, at last, Darcy's reply pierced through the stillness. "I'm the last person to give advice on matters of the heart," he said firmly. Bingley's face twisted into a mask of disbelief as he struggled to comprehend the unexpected words coming from Darcy's mouth. Darcy was the very picture of contrition, from the way he averted his eyes to the tenor of his voice. Bingley's brows furrowed and his jaw clenched as he stared at his long-time friend. He probed further, his voice wavering slightly. "That is a stark departure from what your feelings once were." Darcy stood stoic and expressionless, like a mask of stone, but a deeper look into his eyes revealed the roiling of emotions beneath the facade, like a stormy sea hidden beneath a tranquil port. After some time, his baritone voice finally filled the air. "Let me just say that experience has taught me to think otherwise," he said, each word laden with the weight of his past. Bingley couldn't believe his ears. Darcy was actually hiding something. Bingley's curiosity was piqued. He didn't want to force it out of Darcy, but he could tell that if he kept up their conversation, he would eventually get what he wanted. He studied Darcy's expression for a few moments, then mustered up the courage to ask, "Dare I ask you to elaborate? Did something happen between you and Miss Elizabeth? The two of you seemed—" His words trailed off as he noticed a slight colouring of Darcy's cheeks when Elizabeth's name was mentioned. His friend's eyes showed a resignation that weighed down the air like a heavy fog. He took a long moment to assess Bingley before he said, "I would rather not speak on the matter. Instead, I will say I support you in whatever you decide, whatever that may be." His words were spoken with a sombre gentleness, as if he accepted his own fate and Bingley's. Bingley nodded, not expecting any more details from Darcy. "And will you return with me to Hertfordshire?" Darcy's response was so instantaneous that it almost appeared rehearsed. His eyes hardened and his tone became unyielding. "No, that is the last place I wish to be," he declared solemnly, his voice echoing off the room's walls. Bingley sighed. He had hoped Darcy would accompany him, but he knew better than to push his friend. He had one more question. "And what about my wedding?" "I must have you stand beside me," said Bingley, his eyes locked with Darcy's as he spoke. He stood firmly, wearing an expression of unwavering resolve, his eyes shining with hope and expectation for his friend to accept his request. The sigh that escaped Darcy's lips bore a hollow ring, as if he was resigned to the fact that he must face a difficult situation, but knew he could not avoid it forever. His voice was quiet yet determined, and his words carried a weight of uncertainty and the slightest hope of a better outcome. He said, "As they say, let us cross that bridge when we come to it." As he analysed Darcy's cryptic statement, Bingley slowly pieced together that something had transpired between his best friend and Miss Elizabeth Bennet. Despite not having the complete story, Bingley knew his friend was still emotionally and deeply entangled with Elizabeth. He envisioned the pain that Darcy would suffer if he were to return to the place where his love and admiration had been denied. Returning to Hertfordshire would be sure to rekindle the passionate ardour Mr. Darcy had held for Elizabeth. Even though Bingley yearned for his friend to join him on his wedding day, he knew what sorrow might lurk in his friend's heart should he choose to return. He slowly nodded in response as he internally acknowledged that for the time being, Darcy's wishes must come first. Then, with a slight smile of understanding, Bingley spoke. "Then it's settled. We shall leave it be until the time arises." The sun shone brightly as Mr. Bingley's carriage proceeded along the long drive leading to Longbourn. His arrival was met with an eager display of anticipation from Mrs. Bennet, while the rest of the family looked on. After a warm welcome and exchanging pleasantries in the usual way, he finally approached the subject that had been foremost on his mind since departing Hertfordshire. With a slight lowering of his voice, he nervously licked his lips and asked, "May I have the privilege of conversing with Miss Bennet alone?" Jane turned crimson. Her hands fidgeted with the dainty ribbons of her dress, twisting them in anticipation. Mrs. Bennet's face brightened with an approving smile as she nodded in agreement. The other members of the family looked on with admiration. Each raised their eyebrows in approval and exchanged pleased nods before slowly making their way out of the room, one by one, with hushed excitement. The song of the birds in the garden provided a gentle background to Elizabeth's footsteps as she meandered her way along the path. She was filled with a mix of joy, sadness, and anticipation that she could just barely contain. The happiness she wished for her dearest sister was now guaranteed. Her heart swelled with pride in the Jane's success, yet envy in equal measure pierced her spirit. She had secretly hoped Mr. Darcy would return, that she might have a chance to make amends for how she had behaved and perhaps start anew. But, alas, his absence could only mean one thing. He must despise her and wish never to see her again. And all things considered, could Elizabeth honestly blame him? The gentle breeze rustled through her hair. Her eyes weighed heavily with unshed tears as she gazed at the sky. But even in that moment of sorrow, a strength within her refused to succumb to despair. And with that strength came a sense of comfort and solace. Knowing that Jane would be happy, and in a passing moment of playfulness, she recalled her mother's cries of joy as they took their leave from the parlour earlier. Their family was saved. Later that day, The afternoon sun bathed Jane's face with a golden glow that almost seemed to radiate from within her as she spoke of her upcoming nuptials. Her joyous expression was captivating, yet contrasted against Elizabeth's tight-lipped smile, which showed the effort required to contain an unseen sorrow. Jane's eyes rested upon Elizabeth for a moment before she spoke. "I sense something of great import vexes you, dearest sister. Pray, tell me what it is," Jane pleaded softly. The beseeching expression in her sister's eyes weakened Elizabeth's resolve to remain tight-lipped. Instead, she sighed and recounted how she had been too proud and stubborn to follow Jane's wise counsel and relinquish her hostility towards Mr. Darcy. All the while, she upbraided herself for her foolish and heedless conduct. "I had thought you had discarded any lingering ill will toward Mr. Darcy. Judging by the way you two had both been getting on, I'd come to rely on it." Elizabeth glanced at her beloved sister with an expression of acute distress. She knew she must divulge the disastrous secret that had encumbered her heart. So, in a timid voice, she began. "On the night of the Netherfield ball, Mr. Darcy declared himself to me in the most fervent terms. At the time, I had no choice but to refuse him, the inevitable conclusion of my misguided plan. Since then, my feelings for him have grown stronger, and I fear his absence is predetermined to ensure that we never see each other again." "Oh, Lizzie," Jane said, shaking her head, "I wish I could ease your pain, but the only thing we can do now is to wait, and perhaps he will return." Elizabeth could not find the strength to be as optimistically inclined as her beloved sister. She had brought about her grief by her harsh words toward Mr. Darcy. Besides, Jane had not witnessed the pain Elizabeth inflicted on the gentleman, or the disappointment in his eyes because of it. Now that her heart yearned for his presence more than ever, she feared it was too late, and all hope was lost. The two sisters embraced tenderly before Elizabeth stepped back and looked into Jane's comforting eyes. Jane, ever the optimist, said in a gentle voice, "We can overcome any obstacle if we stay true to ourselves and never give up. My upcoming wedding at Netherfield might be the very thing that brings Mr. Darcy and you together again." Elizabeth's heart refused to be comforted, no matter how much she longed for something better. She was torn between wishing for a more promising result and being entirely overcome by fear and uncertainty. Yet, despite the peril of it, there remained a spark of optimism that she could not yet bear to fan into life for fear of the pain that would surely follow if it were extinguished. Chapter 19. Elizabeth sat motionless in the corner of her room, her hands clasped tightly together and her brow furrowed in intense concentration. Thoughts of what Mr. Darcy had done to save her family from debt because of Wickham's fraudulent scheme weighed heavily on her mind, and now, when all such sentiments were in vain, the notion of what might have been caused her heart to break. Alas, she had ruined the chance to have a life with Mr. Darcy, and she had only herself to blame. The room was dark, the large window letting in only a sliver of light from the setting sun outside. Jane sat at the foot of the bed, regarding her sister with nothing but compassion. An oppressive gloom had enshrouded Elizabeth, and no solace seemed attainable. No respite from the anguish-filled mire was in sight. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she tried to hold them back, but the emotion was so intense that some tears still spilled down her cheeks. Jane sighed and moved to envelop Elizabeth in her warm embrace. Elizabeth was so grateful for her sister's unconditional support at that moment. "Dearest Lizzie," Jane said softly, "if you truly love him, you must set aside your pride. Go to London and stay with our uncle and aunt, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner. You know how much they enjoy your company. What with your being one of their favourite nieces, they will be delighted to have you stay with them. Soon after your arrival, you're to make it known to Mr. Darcy that you are in town and find a way to meet with him. Explain everything, apologise and mend what has been broken." A wave of apprehension washed over Elizabeth. She trembled to think about what she had done to Mr. Darcy, and the thought brought a lump of heaviness to her chest. Her misdeed was undeniable, and the guilt of it was increasingly hard to bear. She seemed to feel the full power of her words and the distress she had caused him in her very core. Tears of sorrow sprung to her eyes as she recalled their last conversation. Her speech had been impertinent. The anguish on his face was something she could never atone for. She feared the condemnation he must be feeling after she had wounded him, and making matters worse, she had done so intentionally. How can I possibly face Mr. Darcy after the manner of our parting? Jane no doubt understood Elizabeth's reservations, but also the importance of taking action. You cannot know the outcome until you try, she said. It is only right that you should attempt a resolution, for nothing ventured is nothing gained. Is that not the same advice you would give were I in your place? What is the worst thing that could happen? Elizabeth looked away, feeling defeated. The worst thing is I see him, and he does not acknowledge my existence. No doubt my misery would be complete. Jane gave her sister a sympathetic look before standing. She walked over to the window, which overlooked the garden in the backyard. No offence, but you seem quite miserable already. One can be just as miserable in London as here in Hertfordshire, and there are far more diversions in the former to entertain. That is true, Elizabeth said, nodding. However, were you in my place, you would have the excuse of calling on your lover's sister as a means of throwing yourself in his path. In my case, I have no such convenient excuse. Miss Bingley despises me, and my feelings for her are mutual. Her spirits rising to mischievousness, she said, I suppose I might conspire to make Miss Darcy's acquaintance, allowing me to throw myself in her brother's path, but you and I both know the viability of my schemes of late. It is what has led to my current predicament, is it not? What I know is you stand a far better chance of seeing Mr. Darcy in town than seeing him here in Hertfordshire. He has agreed to attend the wedding, but that is months from now, and as for the manner of bringing an encounter with the gentleman about, I posit you must wait and cross that bridge when you come to it. Elizabeth allowed a small hopeful smile to curl her lips. Jane's words make perfect sense. Regardless of the consequence, I must make amends. I shall go, if nothing else. I owe Mr. Darcy an apology. Jane returned to Elizabeth's side and squeezed her sister's hand. Well then, you have made your decision. I'm proud of you for that. Whatever the outcome, you have done the honourable thing by taking responsibility for your actions. Elizabeth gave a grateful nod as she rose from the bed, already preparing in her mind for the journey. She had always been strong-willed, but this recent turn of events had tested her character and fortitude. In the tumult of a soul wrought with anguish, Jane had been a refuge of solace. Elizabeth was sure she would have been incapable of navigating these courses without her. She set her jaw with determination. Let us pack my things, she declared. The time has come for me to right the wrongs I have committed and bear the consequences of my actions. Elizabeth and Jane embraced, their arms tightly draped around each other to keep their doubts and fears at bay. Elizabeth could feel her sister's heart pounding against her own as they shared a moment of sisterly affection. Their hearts weighed heavily, knowing that no decision would be easy. They both wanted the same thing, for Elizabeth to find her happy ending with Mr. Darcy. Still, they also knew that taking action would come with consequences they couldn't yet predict. They released each other, lingering in the moment before Elizabeth took those final steps forward. This was a voyage of immense import to Elizabeth, one with the potential to lift her spirits to an unfathomable height, or break them into a million pieces never to be mended. Still, it was one she needed to take, a course of action that could no longer be delayed, and one she meant to face with boldness and grit that only she could possess. Whether I find a resolution or whether my courage is in vain, I shall find out soon enough. Chapter 20. The first time Elizabeth saw Mr. Darcy since her arrival in town was when she was out window shopping with her aunt Mrs. Gardiner in Mayfair. As she passed a store, Elizabeth's scrutiny locked on the ornate family crest adorning the carriage, with its intricate design and opulent display. She caught sight of Mr. Darcy's aloof figure taking up space within, but he didn't turn his head to meet her gaze as the conveyance slowly moved away from her view, leaving Elizabeth standing there with no more than a faint trace of his passing by to show for it. It was just as well, Elizabeth considered. She had yet to confide in her aunt the reason she was in town. The less anyone knew of her intentions, the less chance anyone could pity her, for suffering a broken heart entirely of her making. The second time occurred when Elizabeth thought she caught Mr. Darcy's eye at the theatre as she walked to her seat. From afar, Mr. Darcy seemed almost regal in a raised box she could only suppose was his own private box, or perhaps it belonged to some other well-connected acquaintance of his. Comporting himself in a noble manner, his expression was difficult to decipher, but could be interpreted as either pleased or displeased. When he did not seek her out during the interval, she supposed he either wanted nothing to do with her or did not recognise her. How she wanted the latter to be the case. The third time was at a museum. Elizabeth's heart was beating so loudly in her ears that she could barely hear her own thoughts. In the museum's background, visitors' and curators' conversations seemed to buzz like a swarm of bees. A soothing hum of hushed reverence surrounded the artwork and statues, a calming atmosphere amidst the tension she felt when she saw Mr. Darcy nearby, lost in conversation with a curator, gesturing toward various pieces of art. He was polished and immaculate, almost regal. Elizabeth felt her heart lurch as their eyes met fleetingly before he moved away, the air between them filled with an inexplicable emptiness that made Elizabeth's chest ache. Elizabeth's busy mind was teeming with suppositions as she thought of the 3 instances in which she had seen Mr. Darcy. Each unfolded with no response or acknowledgement from him, save the blank stare at the museum that seemed to say he was entirely elsewhere. Besides the physical distance, an invisible wall existed between them, an impenetrable barrier comprised of emptiness and unfulfilled longing. But he told me he loved me, most ardently. He offered his hand to me, he wanted me to be his wife. And now he acts as though he doesn't even know I'm alive. You refused his proposal, Elizabeth silently lamented, as though she were chastising herself. You led him on, pretending you cared when all along you meant to humiliate him. The self-chastisement continued in her mind. But I did care. I do care. I was a fool, allowing prepossession and my foolish obsession with revenge to overrule my innermost desire. It was painfully clear that either Mr. Darcy had no interest in her, or whatever interest he may have had was buried deep beneath his stern exterior. Nevertheless, Elizabeth couldn't help but cling to a vestige of hope that the breach between them stood a chance of healing, and if that was indeed the case, she would have to be the one to make the start. She sat at the writing desk, her eyes on the blank paper before her. Her slender fingers gripped the quill, her eyes focused intently on the task at hand, and with a sense of determination and resolve she began to write, "Dear Mr. Darcy, my spirits flutter at the prospect of writing this letter to you. Yet I have taken time for earnest consideration, and have concluded that this must be done. Over the last few weeks, I have had the chance to see you in town frequently, yet we have been unable to have a conversation. I would greatly appreciate it if you could take the time to meet with me, so that we could have the opportunity to discuss matters of mutual interest. I propose we meet at the park near my uncle's home on Gracechurch Street at 2 o'clock on Sunday afternoon. It would be an honour if you would accept my invitation so we might use the occasion to clear any misunderstandings between us. Yours faithfully, Elizabeth Bennet." Mr. Darcy held the letter from Elizabeth, and as he began to peruse its contents, he was immediately thrown into a tumult of sensations. He had been purposely avoiding her. She had to have known and understood his reasoning, yet Elizabeth had still reached out to him. He reread the letter, weighing his options. To keep her at a distance or attempt to resolve their differences. Her sister and his friend were engaged to be married after all. A formidable face-to-face meeting with Elizabeth was destined to take place. He stared out the window, watching as the lamplight cast a warm glow over his desk and its contents. A pile of letters, an inkwell, and an elegant quill pen. The disturbance in his mind eased, as he remembered the warmth of Elizabeth's countenance when he glimpsed her at the museum. He finally made his decision and picked up his pen to reply to her letter. "Dear Miss Bennet, I accept your invitation, and will be at the designated park at the requested hour. Sincerely, Wefty." The sun shone brightly in the crisp winter air as Mr. Darcy stood in the park on Sunday afternoon, awaiting Elizabeth's arrival. He admired her beauty as she gracefully approached him, the sun reflecting off her dark locks that had escaped her bonnet. A wave of awkwardness passed between them when they finally stood face to face. Neither could find the words to break the silence, so they stood quietly, taking in the tranquillity of the surroundings. Elizabeth darted her eyes around nervously, her stomach fluttering with anticipation. Finally, she cleared her throat and opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. At length she found her voice and broke the tense atmosphere. "Thank you for coming," she said, trembling slightly. "Of course," he replied, his deep voice soft. He gestured towards a nearby bench, and they both took a seat, their bodies separated by an invisible wall of frustrated hopes. They each sat in their own private reveries until Elizabeth spoke again. "I must apologise for the abruptness in my letter," she said, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "I know it was improper to write to you, but I did not know how else to approach you since my arrival in town." Mr. Darcy nodded, his face unreadable. He cleared his throat before speaking. "I suppose I should not have been avoiding you," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I make no such claim that it was unintentional, but seeing you time and again and in the most unlikely places sent my equanimity and resolve into disarray. I was insufficiently prepared to address them at the time." His candour took Elizabeth aback. For all she knew, Mr. Darcy may have seen her on more occasions than she realised. But what would have been the point of approaching her, the woman who had deliberately toyed with his affections and broken his heart? Darcy shifted. Sitting beside him was the woman who had deliberately toyed with his affections. Was there any wonder he meant to shield his heart from the possibility of further misuse? But each sighting of her of late had merely tempered his anger and melted his frozen heart, chipping away at his steadfast determination to avoid her. So much so that by the time he received her letter, an ambitious move on her part that taught him to hope, he had all but forgiven her. Almost. He had answered her call by being there. The ball was in her court. "Why did you ask me to meet you? I feel terrible about the manner in which things unfolded between us," she said softly. "Is that not what you planned all along? To make me fall in love with you so that you might humiliate me by refusing my proposal?" To Elizabeth's surprised look, Mr. Darcy continued, "Yes, I know it all, and have known from almost the beginning of your scheme's inception. You knew, and yet you went along with it, letting me convince myself of my ability to manipulate the feelings of others and bend them to my will." "I am not proud of what my behaviour may have been," Mr. Darcy said, "but what you didn't seem to understand was how deeply I cared for you. Little did you know I was already in your power, almost from the moment we met. I do not regret the time I spent getting better acquainted with you. My greatest regret is that I failed in trying to show you a different side of my character, to prove myself to be a man worthy of your good opinion and your esteem. In the end, you went ahead with your predetermined plan to humble me, proving me incapable of showing my true worth to you." Elizabeth felt her face burn with shame. She had expected his acrimony, but hearing the raw emotion in Mr. Darcy's voice sent a wave of guilt and sorrow coursing through her body. "Sir, you make it all sound so simple when nothing could be further from the truth. I am not here to make excuses for what I did, and were it in my power, I would not have toyed with your sensibilities as I had set out to do. I was a fool to think I could play with fire and not get burned, to think I could make you fall in love with me without subjecting my own heart to the same fate." He slid closer and closer, a hair's breadth away. His piercing stare burned into her. "And why should I believe you're not toying with me now?" Darcy asked, his tone challenging, yet seductive. "Because my heart is in it now. I'm no longer playing a game but fighting for a real future. With you," she confessed. "Are you saying you're in love with me, Miss Bennet?" Elizabeth nodded. "Hopelessly, I fear. And rest assured, my feelings for you do not come from any scheme but from the depths of my soul." He half scoffed. "When did you discover that?" "I do not know when I made a start. I suspect it was before the Netherfield ball, but never were my sentiments clearer than when I learned the details about your involvement in Wickham's leaving Hertfordshire. Not so much because of your benevolence towards someone you no longer deemed worthy of such consideration, but because you saved countless families from financial ruin in paying off all Wickham's debts, including my family. I do not know that we can ever thank you enough. If you would thank me, let it be on your own behalf. Your family owes me nothing. While Wickham was the largest beneficiary of my actions, having been spared from imprisonment, my thoughts of you compelled me to consider coming to his rescue. I wanted him as far away from you as possible, just as you suspected. And I was too blind to see, too naive to know what was in my best interest despite your urging me otherwise. Is it even possible for me to make amends?" His expression finally softened. "Miss Elizabeth," he said, his voice heavy with emotion, "I know you are worried that you may have ruined things between us, but you needn't be. Your courage and your steadfast adherence to the strength of your convictions are among the things I admire most about you. I want you to know that I accept your apology and will always be here to support you, no matter what." "That's very kind of you," Elizabeth said, her heart swelling with emotion as she realized the true character of the man beside her. "Pray, you will accept my apology as well. Had I behaved more gentlemanly from the first moment of our acquaintance, you and I would be in a far more agreeable place by now. As for my offence against your sister, pray forgive me for attempting to persuade Bingley against her. I believe the two of them are well suited, and I wholeheartedly embrace their alliance." "Thank you for saying that, sir, and of course, I accept your apology on my sister's behalf and on my own." "That said, pray where do we go from here?" Darcy said, offering her a warm smile. Her spirits rising to light-heartedness, Elizabeth said, "I do not suppose a renewal of your avowal on that fateful evening is a possibility?" His own spirits heightened. Mr. Darcy asked, "I am sorry, but what avowal are you speaking of?" Fully aware of his teasing, Elizabeth said, "If I were ever in want of a husband, no one could ever be as worthy of my consideration as you." "Did I say all that?" "Well, words of a similar vein. I'm almost certain of it." At this, Mr. Darcy smiled wider, and his gaze deepened. "Supposing you are in want of a husband, I respectfully renew my proposal." Elizabeth felt her heart swell as she looked into his eyes, feeling a deep and abiding respect for the man she thought she had lost. Then, with a nod and a smile, she said, "Yes, Mr. Darcy, I accept your proposal." Elizabeth's reply produced such happiness as the besotted gentleman had probably never felt before. His face lit up, eyes shining with joy. A gentle smile adorned his lips. His arms effortlessly drew her close, wanting to show her how much he loved her. He brushed a tender kiss on her lips, completely lost in the moment, forgetting everything around them. Fortunately, no one else was in sight except the servant who had accompanied Elizabeth to the park. To her credit, she sat a pleasantly respectable distance away, and was sensible enough to have her head buried in a book. Elizabeth's heart fluttered and she could feel her face flush. His lips were so soft and gentle, sending a shiver through her body. She couldn't help but respond, her mouth parting in an invitation to a deeper kiss. His tongue moved in perfect harmony with hers as their kiss deepened and intensified. Finally, Mr. Darcy broke away and rested his forehead against hers. He sighed contentedly before lifting her head and gazing into her eyes, leaving her yearning for more. He looked at Elizabeth with a deep, burning desire that made her feel completely alive and loved. Elizabeth smiled, knowing with certainty that this perfect moment marked the end of her anguish and regret, and the beginning of a love affair with Mr. Darcy meant to last a lifetime. Chapter 21. Having wandered to a part of the park where passers-by were enjoying the crisp winter air, the two lovers found more subtle means of expressing their mutually confessed feelings. They walked side by side, his steps in perfect harmony with hers, enjoying the warmth of their being so close to each other. Every so often Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth's hands came together. Their fingers touched for the briefest of moments, and Elizabeth felt a spark course through her body. They locked eyes, and Elizabeth felt as if their connection was unbreakable. Mr. Darcy's gaze was tender and loving, and he leaned in close to her as they spoke, their conversation full of joy and excitement. Her love for the gentleman close beside her increased with every passing moment as they discussed their future. With so much to decide concerning what lay ahead, Mr. Darcy moved closer to Elizabeth, his warm breath against her cheek. "When shall we marry?" he asked, brushing Elizabeth's hand with his own, the intimate gesture making Elizabeth's heart flutter with anticipation. "Ideally, I would like to marry you as soon as possible." Elizabeth's breath quickened as a rush of enthusiasm surged through her. "Oh, Mr. Darcy, with all my being, I desire to be wed as soon as possible," she replied, barely able to contain her emotion. He smiled, no doubt pleased knowing her feelings echoed his own. "Then it shall be done." Thoughts of Jane's impending nuptials crossed Elizabeth's mind, and the prospect of a double wedding ceremony was tempting. She told Mr. Darcy as much. "But I fear overshadowing Jane's special day," she said hesitantly. "Do you suppose it would be inappropriate to celebrate our wedding day with Jane and Mr. Bingley? What with her being my dearest sister and his being your closest friend, such a prospect will be most advantageous, do you not agree? So long as there is no thought of us remaining in one another's company beyond the wedding breakfast, I can have no cause to repine. I have plans of my own involving just the two of us." "Mr. Darcy," Elizabeth exclaimed with feigned astonishment, playfully nudging him with her elbow in reproach. "What?" he asked, a boyish charm etched across his face. "Wait, did I say that out loud?" Elizabeth gave a low chuckle, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "Indeed you did." The curious creature that she was, Elizabeth couldn't help but let her imagination wander. What would their life be like as husband and wife? She had any number of fantasies, but steeled herself and focused on one day at a time. Mr. Darcy shifted his gaze, his expression a mix of uneasiness and sheepishness. He cleared his throat and continued, "Well then, I ought to have said that if it pleases you, you must write to your sister immediately and propose the idea of a double wedding." She marvelled deep inside. How ironic that Mr. Darcy's initial abhorrence for the idea of his friend and my sister marrying is what started us on this path to retribution, redemption, and ultimately this moment. Is there a truer symptom of love than letting go of one's misguided opinions? Elizabeth smiled. "It does please me, very much so, and I shall write to Jane as soon as I return to my relations' home." Elizabeth then consulted her watch. "Speaking of which, I believe I ought to be heading back, else my aunt will surely wonder where I've gone off to for so long." With a sigh, Mr. Darcy asked, "Must you go so soon?" "I fear I must," Elizabeth replied regretfully. "May I accompany you?" She raised one eyebrow in surprise. "Are you certain you wish to meet my London relations so soon upon the heels of our engagement?" Mr. Darcy looked at Elizabeth tenderly, his eyes shining with love and admiration. He reached out his hand to take hers in a warm caress. His voice, gentle and sincere, he said, "Your family will soon be my family. I see no reason to delay the introductions. The same goes for your meeting my sister Georgiana, who has her own establishment here in town, and my uncle and aunt Lord and Lady Fitzwilliam, who are also in London for the season." Mr. Darcy's gaze lingered on Elizabeth's face for a moment before he slowly reached for her free hand. He lifted it to his lips and paused, his eyes closing as he brushed a feather-light kiss across her knuckles. Once again his eyes met hers. "No words can express the depth of my devotion to you, my love. My heart beats only for you. From this moment forward, my dearest, loveliest Elizabeth, I never wish to be parted with you again." The feel of him, how his thumb traced her palm, drew her close. Their surroundings blurred away as his breathing matched hers. Elizabeth blinked several times, then stared into the eyes of the man she loved, the sound of her heartbeat echoing in her ears. Mr. Darcy stared at Elizabeth's slightly parted lips with a mixture of longing and passion in his dark eyes, making her skin tingle. His face moved closer to hers, and his gaze shifted from her lips to her eyes, lingering on one for a moment before moving to the other. The look on his face was one of adoration, and his eyes searched hers for unwavering proof that she returned his affections. "Nor do I ever wish to be apart from you. I love you with all of my heart, Mr. Darcy." "You cannot know how it makes me feel hearing you say that. I cannot wait to call you my wife, Elizabeth," he whispered. Elizabeth's heart swelled with joy, a feeling of sheer bliss that nearly brought tears to her eyes. So, this is what true love feels like, she thought to herself. She felt safe and cherished, and filled with a sense of contentment she had never known. Her heart raced with excitement as she thought of the day when the entire world would know how much she adored the one who had given her so much love and affection, Mr. Darcy. Epilogue. Meryton and the surrounding environs were in an uproar with the news of a second Bennet-daughter engagement spreading throughout. Naturally, Mrs. Bennet was overjoyed. She had remained in a state of merriment ever since her second eldest daughter had accepted the proposal of a gentleman with £10,000 a year and such noble relations. This was a remarkable event, and all fortunate enough to call the Bennets their friends and neighbours were eager to rejoice in the auspicious occasion. "Oh, my dears," Mrs. Bennet said to her eldest daughters, clasping her hands with such delight, "this is the happiest day of my life. The two of you are to be wed." She wiped away a few stray tears from her eyes. What a happy day indeed for the eager matriarch. Having laboured for weeks in preparation for the weddings, Mrs. Bennet's satisfaction was incomparable. Soon enough, her maternal ambition would come to fruition, as only 3 daughters remained to be given away in matrimony, a circumstance which caused her peculiar gratification. Not everyone could be as pleased as Mrs. Bennet. Caroline Bingley seemed not to share in the proud mamma's opinion. Her countenance remained displeased in the days preceding the 2 couples' nuptials, not necessarily because of her brother's alliance, but more from Mr. Darcy's. All her disdain was kept beneath a thin layer of appropriateness, though it was plain to see that she did not care for the union. But, no matter her opinion, the deed had been done, and there was no undoing it. Mr. Darcy's young sister, Miss Georgiana Darcy, whom Elizabeth enjoyed meeting while in town, really loved Elizabeth, as did all of Darcy's relations, at least the ones she had met. A meeting with his aunt Lady Catherine de Bourgh was to be held in the spring during the Grand Dame's favourite nephew's annual trip to Kent. Elizabeth was dreading the company of a woman who was known for her officiousness and condescension. Thus, she anticipated spending much of her time in Kent with her dear friend Charlotte. Lady Catherine grudgingly accepted Mr. Darcy's marriage, having written a scathing letter in response to it, declaring she would have done all she could have to prevent him from making such a dreadful mistake had she only known about it sooner. But as Darcy's standing invitation remained uncontested, Lady Catherine could only hope he had chosen a subdued sort of creature as his bride, someone she could work on. The day Darcy accompanied Elizabeth to the gardener's home after declaring his love and asking for her hand in marriage, he was welcomed with all the warmth and excitement the newly betrothed gentleman of one's favourite niece could hope for. As Darcy sat in their modest but cosy parlour, he could not help but be charmed by Mrs. Gardiner's intelligence and understanding, and her husband's sensible observations and keen judgment. While he and Elizabeth remained in town before returning to Hertfordshire, Darcy made a concerted effort to better acquaint himself with the Gardiners, visiting their home every day and engaging in long conversations. Much to Elizabeth's delight, her aunt and uncle loved Mr. Darcy very much, so it always pleased her when she recalled her favourite aunt's words, "It is evident, my dearest Lizzie, that such a relationship as yours and Mr. Darcy's is a testament that true love can conquer even the greatest differences between 2 people." Indeed, though Elizabeth would have liked to have credited the Gardiners as the means of uniting the 2 of them by allowing her to come to London and stay in their home, deep in her heart she knew her sister Jane deserved the credit more. Jane's encouraging words to Elizabeth to follow her heart were the true impetus in her going to London and doing everything in her power to make her fondest dreams come true. And so the happy couple, Mr. and Mrs. Darcy, embarked on their felicitous journey together as they began the start of their lives. United in love and forever entwined, Darcy and Elizabeth made a perfect pair, each granting the other the strength, comfort and companionship to traverse their future together as one. Both were utterly contented and secure in knowing their abiding connection was the key to unlocking all of life's possibilities, happily ever after. Thank you for listening to Her Spirits Rising to Playfulness, written by P.O. Dixon, read by Christopher. If you enjoyed the story, and I sincerely hope you did, please take a moment to like, share, and comment. If you have not yet subscribed, I invite you to do so now. It makes all the difference in encouraging me to share my stories here on YouTube. And be sure to search for and listen to more of my stories like this one, stories that will make you fall in love time and time again. Your continuing support helps this channel grow,